While I was away securing a corporate merger in Chicago, my parents forced my 7-year-old son to scrub grout until his hands bled. They told him he should be grateful they even let him stay in the house. The house I bought. The house they lived in, rent-free. My son never told me. He wrapped his small fingers in paper towels so he would not leave marks on the white baseboards. What my parents did not know was that someone else was already watching. Rain fell in heavy sheets across the windshield of an idling black sedan, turning my sprawling Indiana estate into a blurred silhouette of gray stone and slate roofing. Inside the vehicle, the heater hummed a low, steady note. A man named Victor Cross sat in the driver's seat. He did not bother wiping the condensation from the glass. He kept his eyes fixed on the rain-slicked driveway, pressing the silver record button on his handheld dictaphone. "Subject is male, 7 years old," he stated. His voice carried the flat, measured cadence of a man who dealt exclusively in facts. "Severe blistering observed on both palms. Subject is performing manual labor in hazardous weather conditions. Trust safe harbor clause materially breached." He released the button. The red recording indicator vanished. Beside him, thick legal file sat perfectly aligned on the passenger seat. He checked his watch. It had been exactly 7 days since the foundation of my family began to crack, and he was there to document every splinter. My name is Dilys Scott. I am 34 years old, and I am the Chief Financial Officer of a premier pharmaceutical distribution firm in Indianapolis. I navigate a daily landscape of calculated risks, razor-thin profit margins, and ruthless negotiations. But for my entire life, my parents treated me as nothing more than a convenient bank. They praised my brother Bradley, funded his lavish lifestyle with my money, and tolerated me only when the bills came due. Years ago, when I asked my father to co-sign my student loans, he laughed in my face and bought my brother a luxury car the very next day. That was the day I learned blood is not a bond, it is a liability. I structured every asset I owned into an irrevocable trust. I built a financial fortress to ensure they could never touch my true wealth. I thought my son and I were safe behind those legal walls. I was wrong. The threat was already sleeping in my guest rooms. If you have ever been the financial backbone of a family that resents your success, you understand the bitter math of obligation. Welcome to Linda Vengeance. Tell me your age in the comments, and let me know if you have ever had to cut off toxic relatives. Now stay with me, because the trap they walked into was flawless, and they built it themselves. 7 days before Victor sat in that car gathering the evidence that would destroy them, my property in Carmel was awash in pristine morning sunlight. I stood in my master suite securing the zipper on my structured leather weekender bag. The Chicago merger required my undivided focus. Leaving Leo under the supervision of my parents, Howard and Susan, was a rare deviation from my meticulous routine. They had volunteered. It was a seemingly generous gesture that temporarily silenced my usual skepticism. I carried my bag down the sweeping staircase, the heels of my pumps clicking a sharp rhythm against the floorboards. Howard paced the grand foyer. He tapped the toe of his leather loafer against the floor, inspecting the grout lines with a critical eye. "Spanish ceramic," he murmured, his tone layered with casual disdain. "You would think a woman in your tax bracket would spring for authentic Italian marble. It compromises the aesthetic. You have to consider the long-term equity of the property." I chose to ignore the critique. I had purchased the home with my own capital. Howard merely occupied the airspace when it suited him, playing the role of the wealthy patriarch, despite having drained his own savings years ago to bail out my brother. In the kitchen, the scent of fresh coffee masked the underlying tension. Susan arranged a bowl of fruit on the counter with practiced, performative warmth. "Do not fret about a single detail," darling Susan said. She offered a smile that failed to reach the cold corners of her eyes. "Leo and I have a wonderful itinerary planned. The Children's Museum, the Botanical Gardens. We might even bake those chocolate chip cookies he loves so much." As she spoke, her hand drifted across the cold granite island. With the fluid, practiced grace of a seasoned card counter, she slid my platinum emergency credit card off the stone. She swept it seamlessly into the depths of her designer tote. I caught the subtle motion. I paused, adjusting the collar of my trench coat, feeling a familiar prickle of irritation. The digital pin activates for any charge exceeding $5,000, I stated. I held my mother's gaze a fraction of a second longer than necessary, making sure she understood the boundary. That card is strictly for Leo. Pediatrician copays, urgent care, nothing else. Susan offered a thin, tolerant sigh. She brushed a speck of imaginary dust from her silk blouse, a gesture designed to make me feel small. We raised you, did we not? I believe we can manage our own grandson for 5 days. Go fight your corporate battles, Dillis. We have everything under control here. Minutes later, the black town car idled at the edge of the driveway, the engine purring. I knelt on the porch, wrapping my arms around Leo. He felt so small in my arms. He hugged me tight, burying his face in the lapel of my coat. I will be back Friday, I promised, kissing the top of his head. Be good for Grandma and Grandpa. I climbed into the back seat and closed the heavy door. Through the tinted window, I watched them. Howard and Susan stood shoulder to shoulder on the porch, smiling and waving with impeccable posture, until my vehicle disappeared beyond the wrought iron gates. The town car smelled of rich leather and ozone. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window, watching the manicured lawns of Carmel roll past. My phone buzzed with an incoming email regarding the merger, pulling my attention back to the corporate battlefield. I pushed down the lingering knot of unease in my stomach. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself they were his grandparents. I would later learn from the security logs and the dictaphone recordings exactly what happened the second my taillights vanished around the bend. The fabricated warmth drained from the house in an instant. Howard dropped his hand. His grandfatherly geniality evaporated into cold, rigid authority. He walked straight into the living room, retrieved the television remote, and locked it inside the oak credenza, pocketing the brass key. He then walked into the hallway and threw a heavy winter coat over the wireless router, intentionally suffocating the network that powered the interior security cameras. Susan turned away from the glass door. She did not look at Leo with the affection of a grandmother. Her expression mirrored a ruthless supervisor evaluating an inconvenience. She walked into the kitchen and opened the cabinet beneath the sink, bypassing the soft sponges and the dish soap. She withdrew a heavy, wooden-handled scrub brush with stiff, yellowed bristles. It was a tool meant for deep industrial cleaning, not for a child. She walked back to the grand foyer and dropped the brush onto the Spanish ceramic tile. It landed with a sharp, hollow clatter that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings. My 7-year-old son jumped at the sound, his eyes wide and uncertain. The foyer needs attention, Susan instructed, her voice stripped of any previous warmth. She gestured toward the expansive floor Howard had just insulted. The grout is turning gray. You will earn your keep while your mother is gone. Start scrubbing and do not stop until I can see my reflection. 2 hours after my flight lifted into the overcast Indiana sky, a sleek silver Range Rover turned onto the private road leading to my property. The wrought iron gates, which Howard had intentionally left open, offered no resistance. My brother Bradley stepped out of the driver's seat. He wore a tailored linen suit that possessed the casual elegance of old money, an aesthetic funded entirely by my stolen dividends. He did not carry a single piece of luggage. That menial task fell to his wife, Vanessa. She emerged from the passenger side, gripping the leather leash of a purebred Afghan hound. Vanessa curated her existence for social media. She possessed a polished, sterile beauty, her blonde hair arranged in perfect, immovable waves, her designer sunglasses shielding her eyes from the gray afternoon light. They walked through the double front doors of my home, carrying themselves not as guests, but as conquerors, claiming their rightful territory. Howard and Susan greeted them in the foyer with open arms and warm embraces. My son Leo stood quietly near the staircase, watching the adults celebrate. He held the wooden scrub brush his grandmother had forced into his hands just moments prior. Howard knew the architecture of my security system. I had paid a premium for a top-tier network to ensure my son remained protected at all times. Howard also knew he could not simply unplug the cameras or sever the power cords without triggering an instant push notification to my phone. He needed plausible deniability. He executed a calculated analog sabotage. He retrieved a thick, heavy wool winter coat from the hall closet. He draped the dense garment over the primary wireless router sitting atop the living room credenza. When Leo asked why he was covering the blinking green lights, Howard offered a smooth, practiced lie. He claimed the thick fabric improved the signal strength for the television. In reality, the dense wool smothered the frequency. The connection choked. The interior cameras flickered and fell into a localized blackout, rendering the inside of my home a dark zone. He effectively blinded me, severing my digital tether to my child. With the electronic eyes covered, the psychological warfare commenced. Leo stood in the kitchen, his small knuckles turning white as he gripped the handle of the brush. His lower lip trembled. He asked if he could use the landline to call me. He just wanted to hear his mother's voice. Howard crossed the room and knelt on the hardwood, bringing his face level with my son. My father possessed a terrifying ability to sound perfectly reasonable while delivering a devastating threat. He did not yell. He kept his tone leveled into a low, steady hum. "Your mother is very busy securing a future for you," Howard said, resting a heavy hand on Leo's narrow shoulder. "If you bother her now with tears and complaints, she will lose her focus. If she loses her focus at this big meeting, she will lose her job. If she loses her job, we lose this house. You do not want to be the reason your mother ends up on the street, do you?" The child shook his head, his eyes wide with sudden terror. He absorbed the manufactured guilt, shouldering a burden of responsibility no 7-year-old should ever carry. He swallowed his tears and nodded. Over the next 4 days, my Carmel estate transformed into a toxic autocracy. It became a private luxury resort for a golden son and his wife, a paradise built on the silent, forced labor of a child. Bradley treated the formal dining room like a 5-star restaurant. He would sit at the head of the long mahogany table, snapping his fingers to summon my son from the kitchen. Leo carried heavy ceramic plates loaded with roasted chicken and grilled asparagus, his thin arms shaking under the weight of the porcelain. If a drop of au jus spilled onto the placemat, Susan did not offer a napkin. She made my son stand in the corner of the room, facing the wall, in silence, while the rest of the family dined and laughed behind his back. Vanessa contributed her own unique layer of cruelty to the daily routine. Her Afghan hound, nervous and poorly trained, ruined a vintage Persian rug in the sunroom. Instead of hiring a professional cleaner or handling the mess herself, Vanessa pointed a manicured finger at Leo. She handed him a roll of paper towels and a harsh industrial carpet cleaner from the utility closet. The chemical fumes burned his eyes and irritated his throat, but he stayed on his hands and knees for nearly an hour, scrubbing away the mess of an animal that received more affection and patience from my family than he did. The physical toll of the labor manifested quickly. The skin on Leo's hands, unaccustomed to harsh chemical detergents and abrasive bristles, began to dry and crack. Raw, weeping blisters formed across his palms and along the sensitive webbing between his fingers. The pain must have been agonizing every time he grasped a handle or turned a faucet. Yet the paralyzing fear Howard had instilled in him kept his mouth firmly shut. He suffered in total silence. My house features miles of pristine, white baseboards. It is a specific design choice meant to convey light, order, and cleanliness. Susan became strangely obsessed with them. She deemed the paint dull. She ordered Leo to crawl along the perimeter of the entire first floor, scrubbing the woodwork with a sponge and bleach until the trim gleamed under the recessed lighting. This is where the true, sickening horror of their facade revealed itself. While scrubbing the hallway, Leo noticed that the cracked, inflamed skin on his right hand had started to seep. A single drop of crimson fell onto the immaculate white trim. Terrified of Susan discovering the stain and punishing him further for ruining her perfect environment, my son crept into the downstairs powder room. He unrolled several lengths of thick, coarse paper towels. He meticulously wrapped his own small blistered fingers in the stiff paper, creating crude bandages. He secured them tightly to his wrists using rubber bands he found inside a desk drawer. The rubber bands pinched his skin, cutting off his circulation, but he did not remove them. He muffled his own wounds. He ensured that his bleeding would not tarnish their spotless surroundings. It was the tragic physical manifestation of my entire family dynamic. Bury the suffering, hide the damage, and keep the surface looking flawless at all costs. As long as the house looked perfect, the pain of the person maintaining it did not matter. While my son knelt on the cold floorboards, breathing in bleach fumes and hiding his own blood, Bradley and Vanessa lounged on the limestone patio out back. They popped the cork on a bottle of my vintage champagne. They clinked their crystal flutes together, toasting to their good fortune and laughing at a joke Howard shared from the doorway. They felt invincible in the afternoon sun. They believed the thick stone walls of the estate shielded their cruelty from the rest of the world. They enjoyed the spoils of my labor, convinced there would be no consequences for their actions. They failed to realize a critical flaw in their strategy. Howard had smothered the internal wireless router, blinding the cameras inside the living spaces. He forgot that the exterior security network operated on a separate hardwired circuit, connected directly to the perimeter gates. The outdoor cameras still functioned perfectly. More importantly, the digital blackout inside the house was not the only thing monitoring their behavior. A human observer had already taken an intense interest in the anomalies occurring on the grounds, and he was preparing to document a crime they never saw coming. Victor Cross sat in the driver's seat of his sedan, the engine idling in the cold Indiana rain. The air inside the cabin smelled of dark roast coffee and damp wool. He was a senior partner at a boutique wealth management firm in downtown Indianapolis. His entire career revolved around the meticulous enforcement of ironclad contracts and the protection of generational assets. He did not operate on emotion or sentimentality. He operated on metadata timestamps and notarized signatures. He adjusted the focal ring on his camera lens, pressing the rubber eye cup against his right eye. Through the magnified glass, the Carmel estate appeared in sharp relief against the gloomy afternoon sky. He was not parked at the edge of the property by accident. He was there because an invisible tripwire had snapped less than 24 hours ago, pulling him out of his office and into the storm. The day prior, a digital transaction hit the servers guarding Dillis Scott's financial assets. The vendor was a premium wellness retreat located just outside the city limits, an exclusive sanctuary catering to the elite. The requested charge was $15,000. The detailed invoice listed a series of extravagant services meant for a weekend of pure indulgence: private cabana rentals, imported mud baths, hot stone therapies, platinum caviar facials. The names attached to the reservation were Susan Bradley and Vanessa. The transaction should have been impossible. Dillis had established a strict $5,000 security threshold on that specific piece of plastic. She had explicitly reminded her mother about that boundary before leaving for Chicago. To bypass the digital barricade, the luxury spa required a signed authorization form from the primary account holder. Bradley thought he possessed the cunning to outsmart his sister. He intercepted an email link sent to the estate network, opened the electronic document on a high-resolution tablet, and used a digital stylus to carefully trace his sister's name across the glowing screen. He assumed his crude forgery would serve as a sufficient skeleton key to unlock the funds. He failed to comprehend the architecture of the vault he was attempting to rob. The platinum card did not draw from a standard checking account. It was tethered directly to the corpus of an irrevocable trust. Dillis had designed the trust to be a self-monitoring fortress, a financial structure capable of defending itself. The moment the forged signature registered in the system, the trust algorithms cross-referenced the geographic location of the digital signature against Dillis Scott's corporate travel itinerary. The discrepancy triggered a silent, high-priority security protocol. The alert bypassed local authorities and landed directly on the desk of the independent executor, Victor Cross. As a fiduciary, Victor was legally bound to investigate any material threat to the trust assets. A $15,000 fraudulent charge elevated the situation from a minor family dispute to federal wire fraud. The moment he reviewed the electronic authorization on his monitors, he recognized the clumsy penmanship. He deployed to the property to conduct a covert audit of the estate, anticipating straightforward financial theft. He did not expect to find an active hostage situation unfolding on the back terrace. Through the telephoto lens, Victor watched the rain intensify. The downpour washed over the expansive limestone patio at the rear of the property. Under the deep, dry overhang of the covered lanai, Bradley lounged on a cushioned teak sofa. He wore a plush, monogrammed robe, holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne. Beside him, Vanessa scrolled through her phone, her designer dog resting comfortably in her lap. They were the picture of unearned leisure, waiting for their spa reservation to begin, entirely funded by the woman they despised. Just beyond the edge of the awning, standing directly in the freezing deluge, was Leo. The boy was soaked to the bone. His cotton shirt clung to his ribs, rendering him a fragile silhouette against the heavy gray storm. Susan stood near the sliding glass doors, her arms crossed defensively over her cashmere sweater to ward off the chill. She pointed a sharp finger toward the center of the patio. She was ordering her 7-year-old grandson to rearrange the heavy wrought iron outdoor furniture to suit her preferences. Victor pressed the shutter button. The camera clicked, capturing the exact moment Bradley took a sip of his sparkling wine while the child strained against the weight of a cast-iron chair. The lens recorded the grimace of pain on Leo's face. It documented the crude paper towel bandages wrapped tightly around the boy's hands, now disintegrating into white pulp under the heavy rain. The chair dragged across the wet limestone, producing a harsh scrape that barely carried over the sound of the storm. Leo slipped his knees, hitting the hard stone. He scrambled back to his feet, terrified of a reprimand, his small shoulders shaking from the cold. He grabbed the heavy metal armrest again, his ruined hands losing their grip on the wet iron. A lesser man might have thrown open the car door, marched across the manicured lawn, and physically extracted the child from the elements. Victor remained perfectly still. Intervention was a temporary fix that would allow the abusers to invent an excuse, apologize, and retreat into the shadows until the next opportunity arose. Victor dealt in permanent solutions. He needed irrefutable proof. He needed a dossier so dense and structurally sound that no amount of tears or familial manipulation could dismantle it. He continued to photograph the scene with cold, methodical precision. He captured Susan retreating inside where it was warm. He captured Vanessa laughing at something on her screen, oblivious to the shivering child 10 feet away. He captured Bradley pointing his champagne flute at Leo, mocking the boy's slow progress. Every digital file burned a permanent timestamp into the metadata. Every pixel cemented their guilt. The trust contained a specific, heavily fortified clause designed to protect the primary beneficiary. The safe harbor provision dictated that the estate must remain a nurturing environment for Leo at all times. Failure to maintain that standard constituted a material breach of the foundational agreement. By forcing the child into hazardous manual labor while simultaneously stealing from the estate funds Howard, Susan, and Bradley had crossed an irreversible threshold. They had unknowingly surrendered their right to inhabit the property. They had converted their status from welcomed guests to hostile entities trespassing on protected ground. Victor watched Leo finally push the last iron chair into its designated position. The boy stood in the rain, his head bowed, waiting for permission to seek shelter. Bradley waved a dismissive hand, signaling the child could leave. Leo trudged toward the utility door, his small body shivering under the freezing downpour. Victor lowered the camera. He removed the memory card, a tiny square of plastic that now held the power to annihilate an entire social dynasty. He slid the card into a protective sleeve and placed it inside a thick, leather-bound legal folder resting on the passenger seat. He closed the folder. The magnetic clasp snapped shut with a definitive, final click. He reached for his encrypted cellular phone, tapping a sequence of numbers to connect directly with his senior litigation associate downtown. He did not need to shout or express outrage. The cold, mechanical gears of justice required only facts to begin turning. File the preliminary injunctions Victor instructed, his voice low and steady in the quiet cabin of the car. Freeze the requested vendor funds pending a fraud investigation. Draft the eviction notices for all adult occupants at the Carmel address. The breach is confirmed. Prepare the paperwork for an immediate asset lockdown. He disconnected the call and placed the phone in the center console. Through the rain-streaked windshield, he looked one last time at the grand facade of the Indiana estate. Inside those thick walls, Howard, Susan, and Bradley believed they had executed the perfect crime. They believed they were masters of a domain they had successfully stolen. They had no idea they were already standing on a trap door, and the man holding the lever had just pulled the pin. I arrived at the Carmel property just after dusk on Friday evening. The Chicago merger was finalized, the contracts were signed, and my professional obligations were fulfilled. I anticipated walking into a warm, welcoming environment. Instead, stepping through the front door felt like crossing the threshold of a sterile, unfamiliar facility. The air inside the house felt dense, stripped of the usual ambient noise of a 7-year-old boy playing. It smelled overwhelmingly of industrial pine and aerosol citrus, a chemical cocktail attempting to mask something stale underneath. My corporate instincts, honed by years of auditing hostile takeovers and dissecting fraudulent ledgers, immediately flared. A seasoned executive learns to read a room before a single word is spoken. The energy in my foyer was wrong. It was too quiet. It was too curated. Susan intercepted me before I could even remove my trench coat. She wore a pristine silk blouse and a wide, practiced smile that showcased her teeth, but left her eyes cold and calculating. She reached out, taking my weekender bag with an exaggerated display of maternal care. "We missed you terribly," Susan crooned, her pitch artificially high. "But we managed beautifully. Bradley has been a perfect angel. He helped with the groceries, he organized the pantry, and he kept Leo so entertained. We barely even noticed you were gone, darling." I walked past her into the formal living room. Bradley slouched on the expensive leather sectional, his feet propped onto the glass coffee table, scrolling through his phone. He did not bother to stand. He offered a lazy wave radiating the unearned arrogance of a man who believed he owned the very cushions he sat upon. Vanessa was conspicuously absent, likely upstairs treating my guest suite like her personal day spa. "Where is my son?" I asked, keeping my voice level, though a cold dread had begun to pool in my stomach. Before Susan could answer, Leo appeared at the top of the staircase. He did not run down to greet me the way he usually did, eager to tell me about his week. He descended the stairs slowly, his posture rigid, his head bowed. He kept his hands tucked deep into the pockets of his denim jeans. I stepped forward, kneeling on the floor to meet him at eye level. "Hey, buddy," I said softly, reaching out to pull him into a hug. As my arms wrapped around his small frame, Bradley shifted on the leather sofa, the material squeaking under his weight. At the sound, Leo flinched. It was not a subtle twitch. It was a full-body recoil, a visceral reaction of pure terror directed entirely at his uncle. My blood turned to ice. A child only flinches like that when they have been conditioned to expect a strike. I pulled back, holding Leo's shoulders. "Look at me," I instructed, my tone shifting from mother to interrogator. "What is wrong?" "Nothing," he whispered, his eyes darting frantically toward Susan, who stood hovering over us like a warden. "Take your hands out of your pockets, Leo," I said. He hesitated, his lower lip trembling. Slowly, he withdrew his hands. The breath caught in my throat. The skin on his small palms was ravaged. The flesh was cracked, peeling, and covered in raw, weeping blisters. The delicate webbing between his fingers was red and inflamed, bearing the unmistakable signs of severe chemical burns and friction damage. "What happened to his hands?" I demanded, standing up and turning my focus squarely on my mother. Susan did not miss a beat. Her expression shifted seamlessly from welcoming host to concerned, slightly exasperated grandparent. She possessed the chilling ability to lie without a single micro-expression of guilt. "Do not overreact, Dillis." Susan sighed, waving a dismissive hand. "He volunteered for a project at school." She walked over to the entryway console table, opened the top drawer, and retrieved a crisp piece of paper. She extended it toward me. I took the document. It was a printed permission slip bearing the logo of Laos Elementary School, authorizing student participation in a spring community garden initiative. They had the children pulling weeds and turning soil behind the gymnasium on Wednesday afternoon. Susan explained smoothly, her voice dripping with manufactured patience. You know how sensitive his skin is. He forgot to wear the gardening gloves I packed for him. I put some aloe on it yesterday. He is fine. I stared at the paper. It looked legitimate. The font was correct. The school letterhead was accurate. For a fraction of a second, the ingrained biological conditioning of a daughter trusting her mother fought against the cold, analytical logic of the chief financial officer. My mind wavered. I questioned my own paranoia. Perhaps the grueling week in Chicago had frayed my nerves. Perhaps I was projecting my historical resentment of my family onto a simple, unfortunate schoolyard accident. That momentary hesitation is the exact psychological trap manipulative people rely upon. They feed you a lie so plausible, so well documented, that you begin to doubt your own reality. I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket. Go upstairs and run the bath, I told Leo gently. I will be right up to help you wash. He scurried up the stairs, desperate to escape the tense atmosphere. I left my parents in the living room, congratulating themselves on their successful deception, and followed my son. In Leo's bedroom, the illusion shattered. I opened his canvas backpack to retrieve his pajamas. Tucked inside the main compartment was his favorite graphic novel, a limited edition comic book I had purchased for him as a reward for a good report card. The glossy cover was ruined. It was torn down the center spine. Spread across the vibrant, colorful pages were large, distinct stains of dried mud, shaped exactly like the paw prints of a large dog. My analytical mind snapped into sharp focus. The puzzle pieces aligned with lethal clarity. School garden projects do not involve purebred Afghan hounds trampling over student backpacks. Dogs do not pull weeds. Furthermore, I remembered the smell lingering on Leo's clothes when I hugged him. It was not the earthy scent of topsoil or mulch. It was the sharp, stinging odor of industrial bleach and ammonia. I walked out of his room and stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at the grand foyer. The Spanish ceramic tile Howard had criticized so harshly on the day of my departure caught the light from the chandelier. The grout lines, normally a muted beige, were blindingly white. They had been scrubbed with a corrosive agent. It was an unnatural cleanliness, the kind achieved only through grueling, repetitive, manual labor. Susan had not presented a genuine school document. She had logged into the parent portal, found a generic template for an upcoming event, printed it, and deployed it as a shield to cover her tracks. The permission slip was a calculated diversionary tactic, a red herring designed to pacify me. They had turned my home into a labor camp, forced my child to maintain it, and crafted a paper trail to deny their crimes. A hot, searing rage ignited in my chest, but I forced my breathing to slow. Confronting them now without concrete proof of their specific actions would only result in more gaslighting. They would pivot, deny, and invent new excuses. Howard would yell. Susan would cry fake tears. Bradley would mock me. They would drain my energy in a pointless verbal sparring match. In the corporate world, you do not accuse a corrupt board of directors of embezzlement until you have the secret ledger in your hands. You smile, you nod, and you wait until they leave the office so you can open their safes. I returned to Leo's room. I drew his bath carefully, washing his hair while avoiding his raw, damaged hands. I read him a story, tucked him into his bed, and promised him he was safe now. I sat in the rocking chair in the corner of his room, watching his chest rise and fall until the clock on the nightstand struck midnight. The house fell into a deep, heavy silence. The guest room doors were closed. The golden child and the abusive grandparents were asleep, resting comfortably on premium mattresses purchased with my capital. I stood up, leaving the nursery. I did not turn on the hallway lights. I navigated the corridors of my own home by memory, slipping through the shadows like a ghost. I bypassed the kitchen and moved silently toward the rear of the property, pushing open the heavy wooden door leading into the utility and laundry room. The scent of bleach was strongest here. I turned on the small fluorescent bulb above the utility sink. My eyes scanned the room, bypassing the detergent bottles and the folded towels, searching for the logistical framework of their operation. People who micromanage others always leave a paper trail. They cannot resist the urge to document their own authority. I found it taped to the side of the metal storage cabinet. It was a single sheet of unlined printer paper, and it held the truth they thought they could hide forever. The fluorescent bulb above the utility sink flickered once before settling into a pale, clinical hum. I stepped closer to the metal storage cabinet, my eyes locked on the single sheet of printer paper fastened to the steel door with a strip of clear tape. The scent of industrial bleach hung thick in the narrow room, stinging the back of my throat. I did not need to ask who authored the document. The handwriting belonged exclusively to my mother. Susan possessed a distinct, elegant cursive script. It was a refined penmanship she had cultivated at a private finishing school decades ago, featuring sweeping loops and sharp, precise slants. She used that beautiful handwriting to draft an indentured servitude ledger for her own 7-year-old grandson. I read the document from top to bottom. It was a grueling 14-point daily schedule. The instructions were not framed as chores. They were written as absolute mandates, carrying the rigid structure of a penal code. Point 3 demanded the grout restoration in the main entryway, specifying the use of a toothbrush and a corrosive whitening agent. Point 6 ordered the daily removal of canine waste from the rear terrace, requiring the stones to be hosed and dried. Point 10 outlines the preparation and delivery of a midday meal for Bradley, explicitly noting that my brother should not be disturbed during his afternoon rest. Point 14 required Howard to have his leather loafers polished before dinner. A weaker person might have torn the paper from the cabinet and screamed. A lesser daughter might have marched up the stairs, thrown open the doors to the guest suites, and demanded a tearful confrontation. I did neither of those things. When you spend your life navigating high-stakes corporate finance, you learn a fundamental truth about human conflict. An emotional outburst is a surrender of power. Screaming validates the opposition. It gives them a reaction to manipulate. I did not want a reaction. I wanted a total, unrecoverable victory. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket. I opened the camera application and snapped a high-resolution photograph of the list, ensuring the timestamp and location data were permanently embedded in the digital file. I then took a secondary photo, capturing the surrounding cleaning supplies to establish the environmental context. I was no longer a mother stumbling upon a tragic secret. I was a chief financial officer conducting an internal audit of a hostile takeover. My parents had breached the perimeter, and I was gathering the evidence required to liquidate them. I left the document exactly where Susan had taped it. I turned off the harsh utility light and walked back through the silent corridors of my Carmel home. The estate felt different now. The walls no longer represented sanctuary. They felt like a crime scene. I bypassed the luxurious guest wings where my abusers slept soundly on premium mattresses. I returned to the nursery. Leo remained asleep, his breathing slow and rhythmic. The moonlight filtered through the plantation shutters, casting thin silver lines across his bed sheets. I pulled the wooden rocking chair closer to the mattress and sat down. His injured hands rested on top of the quilt. The crude, stiff paper towel bandages he had fashioned for himself looked tragic in the pale light. I leaned forward. I carefully lifted his right hand, supporting his wrist, so I would not wake him. I lowered my head, pressing my lips gently against the raised, weeping blister on his palm. A sharp, breathless sorrow hit my chest. It was the primal, agonizing guilt of a parent realizing they failed to protect their child from the monsters hiding in plain sight. But the sorrow did not last. The heat of the tears burning behind my eyes rapidly cooled, crystallizing into a dense, icy rage. I held his small hand in the dark, making a silent, unbreakable promise. They would pay for every single crack in his skin. Dawn broke over Indiana with a muted gray light. The house remained quiet. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of black coffee, watching the digital clock on the oven display shift to 6 a.m. I opened the primary security application on my phone. The interface loaded, displaying a grid of dark gray squares where the live interior video feeds should have been transmitting. A red error banner warned of a disconnected network node. I stood up and walked into the living room. I approached the oak credenza where the central wireless router was installed. I found a heavy, insulated wool winter coat draped carelessly over the equipment. It was a classic camel hair overcoat. I recognized the brand and the tailoring. It belonged to Howard. I lifted the heavy fabric. Beneath the suffocating weight of the wool, the router felt hot to the touch. The thermal exhaust had been blocked, and the radio frequency had been choked into submission. The moment I removed the coat, the row of green indicator lights blinked back to life. My phone vibrated in my pocket as the security application reconnected, flooding the screen with live interior feeds. Howard had executed a calculated technical sabotage. He possessed enough cunning to know severing a power cord would trigger a tamper alert. He opted for plausible deniability, intending to claim he merely set his coat down and forgot about it. It was a cowardly, effective maneuver designed to blind me while they operated in the shadows. I looked at the camel coat in my hands. The puzzle locked into its final configuration. My parents were not simply protecting their golden child. They were actively engaged in a psychological campaign to subjugate mine. They resented my independence. They despised the wealth I had built without their assistance. They could not break my career, so they targeted the only vulnerability I possessed. They systematically reduced my son to a servant to elevate Bradley into a false king. It was a manufactured caste system implemented under my own roof. At 8 o'clock, the kitchen doors swung open. Susan entered wearing a plush cashmere robe, her hair perfectly styled. Bradley followed a moment later, rubbing his eyes and yawning loudly. They moved through my space with an infectious, unearned confidence. "Good morning, Dillis," Susan chimed, her voice a practiced melody. "Did you sleep well?" I took a slow sip of my coffee. "Very deeply," I replied, my tone an ocean of corporate neutrality. It is amazing what clarity a good night provides. Bradley walked past me, glaring at the expensive espresso machine on the counter, as if it offended him. "The milk frother is acting up again," he complained, tapping the stainless steel nozzle. "You really need to hire a maintenance crew for this place. It is falling apart." Susan sighed, leaning against the granite island. "We were just saying that yesterday. A house this size requires constant upkeep. Leo helped a bit with the dusting, but a boy his age really needs to learn the value of $1. I looked at my mother. I studied the hollow arrogance in her eyes. I did not blink. "He will learn exactly what things cost," I said softly. Susan smiled, missing the lethal subtext entirely. "I am glad we agree. Now be a dear and fix your brother's coffee. He has a headache." I set my ceramic mug on the counter. The ceramic clicked against the granite. "I am afraid I have urgent financial matters to attend to this morning," I stated, turning away from them. "You will have to manage your own beverages." I walked out of the kitchen, leaving them standing in confused silence. I did not look back. I marched straight to the opposite wing of the estate, entering my home office. It was a sanctuary of glass, steel, and dark oak. I closed the heavy door and turned the brass deadbolt, locking the world outside. I sat down in my leather executive chair and opened my high-performance laptop. The screen illuminated my face. If Howard, Susan, and Bradley were brazen enough to enslave my child and blind my security system, they were undoubtedly careless in other sectors. Criminals of convenience always leave a trail of breadcrumbs. They feel entitled to the spoils, which makes them sloppy. I knew they viewed me as an endless treasury. I just needed to prove it. I bypassed my standard checking accounts and opened the encrypted central banking portal. I navigated through the digital security checkpoints, pulling up the master ledger for the emergency platinum card I had explicitly warned Susan about. I adjusted the date parameters, filtering the search to isolate the 5 days I had spent in Chicago. I pressed the enter key, executing the query. The screen flashed bright white for a fraction of a second before the transaction history populated the monitor. I leaned closer to the glass, preparing to hunt my own family through the columns of their bank statements. The monitor of my laptop cast a harsh blue glow across the mahogany desk. I navigated the encrypted portals of my primary financial institution. My keystrokes were sharp and deliberate. I accessed the ledger for the platinum emergency card I had explicitly entrusted to Susan. The transaction history populated the screen. A single, glaring line item sat at the top of the pending column. The vendor was a premium wellness retreat located just outside the city. The requested charge was $15,000. I stared at the number. My mind processed the data with cold efficiency. A luxury spa does not process a transaction of that magnitude without an authorized signature on file. I clicked the hyperlink attached to the invoice requesting the supporting documentation. A digital copy of the authorization form materialized on my screen. At the bottom of the digital document, scrawled across the designated line, was my name. The loops and angles attempted to mimic my signature, but the execution was sloppy. The pressure points were wrong. The slant was entirely foreign. It was a crude forgery executed by someone who possessed supreme arrogance but lacked attention to detail. Bradley. My brother had traced my name on a screen to steal $15,000 for mud baths and massages, while my son scrubbed the floors of my home. In corporate finance, a single instance of fraud is rarely an isolated event. It is usually the visible tip of a submerged systemic rot. If Bradley felt emboldened enough to bypass a high-security credit limit, he had practiced this maneuver before. He had built his confidence through smaller, successful thefts. I closed the credit ledger and opened my master investment portfolio. I directed my focus away from daily expenses and toward the passive income streams I rarely monitored on a weekly basis. I targeted my quarterly dividend payouts. These were substantial yields generated from a private equity fund I had invested in nearly a decade ago. The dividends were designed to automatically route into a secondary savings account designated for Leo's future university tuition. I initiated an audit of the routing history. I scrolled past the current quarter, tracing the deposits backward through the fiscal year. The anomaly appeared 8 months ago. In October of the previous year, the routing sequence for the automated clearinghouse transfer had been meticulously altered. 2 digits in the destination account number were swapped. It was a subtle, highly calculated modification. The funds did not bounce back to the brokerage. They were successfully redirected into an external account. I ran a trace on the destination routing number. It belonged to a regional bank located 3 miles from my estate. It was the exact branch where Howard and Susan held their joint checking account. The architecture of their theft became agonizingly clear. Bradley did not have the technical proficiency to alter a clearinghouse sequence on his own. Howard, who fancied himself a retired businessman, possessed the foundational knowledge to execute the routing swap. Susan, who managed the family mail, intercepted the physical confirmation letters and destroyed them. They worked in tandem. My parents were systematically intercepting my dividends, funneling the wealth into their own accounts, and then laundering the stolen funds directly to Bradley to maintain his facade of aristocratic success. They had been financing the golden child using the inheritance meant for the grandson they treated like a servant. I did not feel shock. I felt a profound, dangerous clarity. The fog of familial obligation evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the stark geometry of a battlefield. I was no longer dealing with toxic relatives. I was dealing with felons. I connected my laptop to the heavy laser printer sitting on the credenza behind my desk. I executed a print command for the forged spa authorization form. The machine whirred to life, spitting out the warm page. I printed the credit card ledger. I printed the 8 months of altered dividend routing histories. I printed the destination account confirmations, linking the theft directly to Howard and Susan. Page after page fell into the output tray. The rhythmic sound of the printer mechanism felt like a metronome, ticking down the final hours of their parasitic existence. I gathered the warm sheets of paper, aligning the edges with precise taps against the glass surface of my desk. I opened a thick black leather dossier and secured the documents inside. It was an airtight, irrefutable catalog of wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. It was the weapon I would use to dismantle their lives. I closed the leather cover of the dossier. The moment my hand left the binder, my cell phone vibrated on the desk. The screen illuminated, displaying an incoming call from an unknown number. The area code was 317, a premium Indianapolis designation often associated with the downtown financial and legal district. I rarely answered unscheduled calls, but the timing felt far too precise to ignore. I pressed the green icon and lifted the device to my ear. "This is Dilla Scott," I answered, my tone guarded and professional. "Ms. Scott," a deep, resonant voice replied. The caller did not sound like a telemarketer or a junior associate. He sounded like a man accustomed to delivering heavy news in quiet rooms. "My name is Victor Cross. I am a senior partner at Cross and Vanguard Wealth Management. I am the independent executor assigned to the irrevocable trust you established for your son, Leo." I stiffened in my chair. The trust was designed to operate silently in the background of my finances. An executor calling my personal line indicated a catastrophic structural event. "Go on, Mr. Cross," I said. 24 hours ago, your trust security algorithms detected a critical anomaly," Victor explained. "A $15,000 transaction was attempted using a forged digital signature. The geographical data of the signature request did not match your verified location in Chicago. The system flagged the event as a priority security breach." "I am looking at the forged document right now," I replied, my eyes fixed on the black dossier. "I am preparing to file criminal charges against my brother." Victor paused for a fraction of a second. "The theft is only a secondary concern, Ms. Scott. The automated fraud alert required me to conduct an immediate, unannounced compliance audit of the Carmel property to ensure the integrity of the trust assets. I arrived at the perimeter of your estate yesterday afternoon during the storm." My grip tightened on the phone. "You were at my house." "I observed the premises from the gate," Victor clarified. "I am required to inform you that I witnessed events that constitute a material breach of the Safe Harbor Clause. I possess time-stamped photographic evidence of a minor child being forced to perform hazardous manual labor in severe weather, directed by the adult occupants of the residence." The air left my lungs. The horror I suspected was now a verified, legally documented fact. My parents had tortured my son while stealing my wealth, and an independent officer of the court had watched them do it. "Do you have the photographs?" I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I have them secured in my vault," Victor confirmed. "Your parents and your brother have unknowingly triggered the revocation protocols of the trust. They are no longer recognized as guests. Their legal status has shifted. I am prepared to initiate eviction and asset reclamation, but I require your formal authorization to proceed." "I do not want to just evict them, Mr. Cross. I want them ruined. I want every single dollar recovered, and I want them removed from my property with zero leverage. I have 8 months of systemic wire fraud printed and sitting on my desk. They have been altering dividend routing numbers." A low hum of approval resonated from the speaker. "You have been busy, Ms. Scott. If you have proof of systemic routing fraud, we possess the leverage to freeze their accounts and initiate felony prosecution. We need to align our documentation. Where do we meet?" I asked. "My office is located in the Chase Tower," Victor said. "We need a private environment to construct the legal framework for their removal. Bring your dossier. I will prepare the trust revocation documents and the eviction notices. We have a trap to build." "I will be there in 30 minutes, I replied. I ended the call and placed the phone in my pocket. I picked up the black leather dossier, its weight a comforting anchor in my hands. I unlocked the door to my home office and stepped out into the hallway. I could hear Bradley laughing in the kitchen, loudly complaining about the quality of the breakfast pastries. They were comfortable. They were complacent. They had no idea the ground beneath their feet had already vanished. I spent 14 days operating as a sleeper agent inside my own residence. The psychological discipline required to sit across from the people who tortured my child, sharing morning coffee and polite conversation, tested the outer limits of my corporate endurance. I smiled. I nodded at my mother's passive-aggressive critiques regarding my wardrobe choices and my demanding career. I listened to my father recount fabricated, grandiose tales of his past business triumphs, nodding as if I believed every word. I watched my brother pour expensive scotch from my private reserve, treating my home as his personal tavern. Every evening, I retreated to my office, locked the door, and coordinated the legal strike with Victor Cross. We built a labyrinth of injunctions, asset freezes, and eviction mandates. We did not leave a single procedural gap. The trap was meticulously calibrated, waiting for the perfect moment to snap shut. The climax of their delusion arrived on the third Sunday of the month. Susan insisted on a lavish family roast to celebrate Bradley securing a vague, unverified consulting interview. She spent the entire afternoon in the kitchen, utilizing premium cuts of beef and imported truffles purchased with my stolen dividends. The dining room table was set with the fine silver and the delicate crystal stemware she had brought out from the display cabinets. The expensive chandelier cast a warm golden glow over the scene, illuminating a portrait of a family that existed only in their shared fabrications. Bradley sat to my right, swirling a heavy glass of Cabernet. Vanessa sat beside him, secretly slipping pieces of expensive prime rib to her hound resting on the vintage Persian rug. At the far end of the table, nearest the kitchen swinging door, sat Leo. His hands were healing. The raw, weeping blisters had scabbed over, replaced by tight pink skin. But the psychological scars lingered in his posture. He kept his eyes focused on his plate, chewing his food in silence, terrified of drawing Howard's attention. I sat quietly eating the meal I had unknowingly financed, watching the theater unfold. The dramatic irony hung thick in the air, a suffocating humidity only I could perceive. They feasted and laughed, entirely oblivious to the fact that their financial executioner was currently driving up the private road leading to the estate. Howard stood at the head of the table. He tapped a silver spoon against the rim of his crystal wine glass. The sharp, high-pitched ring demanded our immediate attention. He adjusted the French cuffs of his tailored shirt, looking down the length of the expansive mahogany table with the pride of a conquering monarch surveying realm. "Family, Howard," began, his voice swelling with unearned authority. "I look around this room tonight and I see the culmination of decades of hard work. We built a legacy." He gestured expansively, his arms encompassing the dining room, the crystal, the very walls of the Carmel estate. "This beautiful home," Howard continued, his tone thick with patriarchal entitlement, "this sanctuary. It stands as a testament to the values Susan and I instilled in our children. It provides a foundation for the next generation to thrive. We weathered storms to secure this piece of the world." He turned his gaze directly toward Bradley, ignoring my presence entirely. "To my son Howard," said, raising his glass higher, "a man of vision and resilience. You have faced setbacks, but you always rise to the occasion. This house, this family, relies on your inherent strength. We toast to your brilliant future, Bradley. May you lead us into the next chapter of our prosperity." Bradley smirked, lifting his own glass of Cabernet to acknowledge the praise. Susan beamed with maternal pride, a wide, genuine smile finally reaching her eyes. She reached out, extending her arm, to clink her crystal against her husband's glass to seal the toast. The delicate chime of the crystal never occurred. Susan's glass stopped midair. A sharp, heavy knock echoed from the grand mahogany front door. It was not the hesitant tap of a neighbor borrowing a cup of sugar, nor the polite rap of a delivery driver. It was a rhythmic, commanding pounding that demanded immediate entry. The sound reverberated through the grand foyer, slicing violently through the warm, self-congratulatory atmosphere of the dining room. Howard frowned, his grand speech derailed by the sudden interruption. He lowered his glass, his expression darkening, clearly annoyed that reality dared to intrude upon his fabricated monologue. He did not look at me. He looked directly at the far end of the table. Leo Howard commanded, pointing a rigid finger toward the hallway. "Go see who is interrupting our dinner. Tell them we are not accepting solicitations tonight." My son froze. His silver fork clattered against his porcelain plate. He began to push his heavy wooden chair back from the table, his conditioned obedience overriding his fear. I placed my linen napkin on the table. "Sit down, Leo," I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried a sub-zero temperature that instantly altered the barometric pressure of the room. It was the first time in 14 days I had dropped the agreeable, compliant facade. The sudden, icy shift in my tone caught Howard completely off guard. He blinked, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "Dilys, the boy needs to learn how to receive guests and make himself useful," Howard argued, attempting to reassert his dominance over the room. I said, "Sit down," I repeated, keeping my eyes locked on my father, while my son pulled his chair back to the edge of the table. I stood up. My heels clicked against the hardwood floor as I walked out of the dining room and into the grand foyer. The doorbell rang, a long, sustained chime that signaled the visitor had zero intention of leaving. I approached the heavy front door, reaching for the brass handle. I did not feel fear. I felt the electric, surging anticipation of a predator watching its prey wander into a canyon with no exit. I pulled the door open. The evening air was cool and crisp. Standing on the porch illuminated by the twin copper sconces was Victor Cross. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that draped perfectly over his broad shoulders, presenting the silhouette of a man who dealt in consequences. He held a thick black leather folder tucked firmly under his left arm. It was the dossier we had spent 2 weeks compiling. Standing one step behind him was a younger associate, a stern woman carrying a secondary briefcase, serving as a legal witness to the proceedings. "Good evening, Miss Scott," Victor said. His voice lacked any trace of conversational warmth. It was the voice of a judge preparing to deliver a final verdict. "Good evening, Mr. Cross," I replied, stepping aside to clear the threshold. "They are in the dining room." Victor did not wipe his shoes on the welcome mat. He stepped directly onto the Spanish ceramic tile, his associate following close behind. He bypassed the standard pleasantries of an invited house guest. He did not ask me to take his coat, and he did not comment on the architecture of the foyer. He walked with measured, purposeful strides down the hallway, navigating my home as if he already held the deed in his breast pocket. I followed in his wake, arriving at the dining room archway just as he entered the space. The scene at the table was a portrait of affluent confusion. Howard remained standing at the head of the table, his wineglass still clutched in his hand. Susan had lowered her arm, her brow crinkled in aristocratic distaste at the uninvited strangers sullying her dinner party. Bradley sat frozen, his smug smirk replaced by a wary, defensive scowl. "Excuse me," Howard barked, his voice rising in volume to mask his sudden insecurity. "Who are you, and how dare you intrude upon my private residence? We are in the middle of a family dinner." Victor Cross stopped at the opposite end of the mahogany table, directly across from Howard. He did not offer a handshake. He did not introduce himself. He placed the heavy black leather folder onto the pristine white tablecloth. The dull thud of the dossier hitting the wood silenced the room. Victor unbuttoned his suit jacket with fluid precision. He swept his cold, analytical gaze across the faces of my parents, my brother, and my sister-in-law. "Remain in your seats," Victor instructed. It was not a request. It was a mandate, delivered with the crushing weight of judicial authority. The sheer force of his presence pinned them to their chairs. Howard opened his mouth to protest, but the words died in his throat as Victor unclasped the leather folder, revealing a thick stack of documents bearing official state seals and notarized signatures. The trap had officially closed. Victor Cross moved with the fluid, unhurried grace of an apex predator. He bypassed the empty chairs along the sides of the mahogany table and positioned himself directly opposite my father. By simply occupying the physical space at the far head of the dining arrangement, the lawyer neutralized Howard's carefully cultivated dominance in a matter of seconds. The visual shift in the room was profound. My father, who had spent the last 20 minutes delivering a grandiose monologue about his legacy, suddenly looked small, flanked by carved prime rib and half-empty wine glasses. The associate placed her secondary briefcase on a side table with a soft, authoritative click. The dining room, previously filled with the rich aromas of roasted meat and expensive Cabernet, suddenly felt sterile. The atmosphere shifted, transforming the family gathering into a formal deposition chamber. Howard gripped the stem of his crystal goblet. His knuckles turned a pale, sickly shade of white. He was a man who relied on volume and intimidation to maintain control over his environment. When faced with an opponent who did not flinch, his only instinct was to escalate the hostility. "I do not know who you think you are," Howard barked. The veins in his neck strained against his starched collar. "You march into my private residence during a closed family dinner. You bypass my front door as if you hold the keys. I want you out of my house this instant, or I will have the local authorities remove you for trespassing." Victor did not blink. He did not acknowledge the threat of police intervention. He operated in a realm of jurisprudence where loud, angry men routinely found themselves silenced by ink and paper. The associate standing a pace behind him remained similarly statuesque, her gaze fixed on a point just above Bradley's terrified face. Victor unclasped the heavy leather dossier he had placed upon the fine linen tablecloth. He folded the cover back, exposing a thick stack of pristine documents. The papers bore the distinctive watermarks of the Indiana State Registry and the embossed seals of certified notaries. He sifted through the initial layer of injunctions and financial audits, his long fingers selecting a specific heavy piece of parchment. He extracted the document and slid it across the polished mahogany. The thick parchment glided smoothly over the wood, stopping precisely an inch from the base of Howard's wineglass. "That is the original certified warranty deed for this property," Victor stated. His voice maintained a low, steady cadence, devoid of any emotional inflection. "It details the precise chain of title, the current taxation records, and the true legal ownership of this estate." Howard glared down at the parchment. He did not reach for it. He treated the paper as if it possessed a lethal electric charge. He traced the edge of the document with his eyes, searching for a flaw, a typo, some microscopic error he could exploit to maintain his fragile reality. As the heavy deed settled onto the table, a vivid, sharp memory surfaced in my mind. 10 years ago, the dynamic of our family had crystallized in a single defining afternoon. I was 24 years old, drowning in the suffocating weight of graduate school tuition. I had drafted a meticulous repayment plan, securing a path to an executive corporate position. I had printed a detailed 5-year amortization schedule on heavy stock paper, color-coding my projected salary trajectories. All I required was a guarantor to co-sign the student loan. I had sat in the cramped living room of my parents' former suburban home, presenting my spreadsheet to Howard. The air in their old living room smelled of cheap carpet cleaner and stale cigarette smoke. Howard did not even look at the second page. He tossed my meticulous work onto the coffee table. He laughed. It was a cruel, dismissive sound that echoed off the cheap drywall. He called my ambition a cute hobby. He told me that backing a daughter was a poor investment, claiming I lacked the ruthless edge required to succeed in the financial sector. Less than an hour later, Bradley walked through the front door. He had just dropped out of a liberal arts college for the second time. He smelled of cheap beer and unearned entitlement. Instead of reprimanding him, Howard's demeanor shifted to pure adoration. He clapped my brother on the shoulder, reached into his pocket, and handed the golden child a set of silver keys. The keys belonged to a brand new imported BMW sedan parked in the driveway, a physical manifestation of his profound bias. That specific Tuesday a decade ago eradicated my final lingering illusion of familial loyalty. I realized they would gladly watch me drown to ensure my brother could sail. When my career eventually launched and the wealth began to accumulate, I did not place a single dollar into a conventional bank account. I paid a premium legal firm to construct a titanium vault. I structured my entire net worth into an irrevocable trust, burying my assets beneath layers of complex corporate shielding. I designed a fortress to ensure that if my parents ever came begging for a lifeline, they would find an impenetrable wall. The echo of that decade-old laughter faded, replaced by the suffocating silence of my dining room. I watched my father stare at the deed. He finally lifted his right hand and tapped a rigid index finger against the top of the parchment. "I know what a property deed is," Howard sneered, attempting to recover his bluster. "It shows that my daughter purchased this home, and since I am the patriarch of this family, her assets fall under my jurisdiction. I manage the equity. I oversee the long-term investments." Victor Cross tilted his head a fraction of an inch. A faint glimmer of professional pity crossed his features. "You are mistaken," Victor corrected. "Ms. Scott does not own this home. She did not purchase this property in her name." The smugness vanished from Howard's face. He shot a confused, frantic glance toward me. Bradley stopped breathing. Even Susan leaned forward, her aristocratic facade cracking under the weight of the sudden revelation. "This estate," Victor continued, tapping his own copy of the ledger, "is owned entirely and exclusively by the Vanguard Legacy Trust. It is an independent corporate entity established for the sole benefit of the minor child, Leo Scott. Dilys Scott operates merely as the grantor. She transferred all capital and real estate into the trust corpus years ago." The blood drained from Howard's face. The vibrant, angry flush in his cheeks evaporated, leaving behind a pale, ashen hue. The visual transformation was striking. He resembled a man who had stepped off a cliff in the dark, only just realizing the ground had vanished beneath his feet. "Therefore," Victor stated, delivering the crushing blow to my father's delusion, "you do not hold any equity here. You possess zero rights to the architecture, the land, or the furnishings. You hold no authority over the perimeter. You are not a patriarch presiding over a legacy. You are an undocumented occupant, residing on corporate property by the grace of a legal loophole." Howard opened his mouth, but his vocal cords refused to function. His entire identity, built on the false premise of wealth and dominance, shattered against the bedrock of the deed. He had spent his life parading through the halls of Carmel, criticizing the Spanish tile and drinking imported wine, believing he commanded the realm. Now an outsider in a bespoke suit had formally reduced him to a squatter. Susan gasped, bringing a trembling hand to her mouth. She looked around the lavish dining room as if the walls were suddenly closing in on her. Bradley gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning white, realizing the financial umbrella he had lived under was a phantom. A lack of ownership was merely the opening salvo. Victor had dismantled their pride, but he had not yet addressed their crimes. The independent executor reached back into the thick leather dossier. He retrieved a secondary stack of papers. These documents were thicker, bound by a heavy brass clip and topped with a glossy, high-resolution photograph. The trap was about to tighten, from a dispute over property rights into a formal declaration of criminal liability. The silence inside the dining space became absolute stretching until it felt physically heavy. My mother finally located her voice, shattering the quiet. Susan pushed her heavy chair backward. The wooden legs scraped violently against the vintage rug. She stood tall, smoothing the front of her expensive silk blouse, desperately attempting to summon the maternal authority she had successfully weaponized for decades. She adopted a rigid posture of wounded dignity. This represented her signature maneuver. Whenever confronted with undeniable factual evidence, she instantly pivoted toward emotional manipulation. Many years ago, when I received my initial paycheck from a demanding summer job, Susan utilized this exact tone to demand I surrender those earnings to the general household fund. She claimed giving her the money demonstrated familial respect. Now facing a ruthless, independent executor, she deployed that identical strategy, hoping to guilt a legal professional into submission. "I refuse to tolerate this level of disrespect in my presence," Susan declared, pressing a trembling hand to her chest. "I am an elder. I am the grandmother of that boy sitting down there. We sacrificed our own comfort to maintain a proper standard of living for this entire family. You cannot simply march in here with pieces of paper and dictate how we operate our lives. We deserve absolute reverence." Victor Cross did not react. He did not raise his pitch. He simply reached toward the secondary stack of documents resting near the property deed. "Respect is a fragile social construct," Susan Victor replied, casually dropping her formal title to assert dominance. My jurisdiction is governed entirely by strict contract law. When your daughter established the Vanguard Legacy Trust, she included a very specific, ironclad stipulation. It is legally known as a morality and safe harbor clause. Victor unfastened the heavy brass clip holding the new stack of papers together. He moved with chilling efficiency, separating the pages. This particular clause dictates that any individual residing on the estate must maintain an environment completely devoid of physical endangerment or psychological abuse toward the primary beneficiary. Victor explained clearly, the sole beneficiary is your grandson, Leo. If the designated executor determines a credible threat exists, the legal standing of the offending occupants becomes immediately nullified. Susan let out a sharp, dismissive scoff. She waved her hand through the air, attempting to swat away the complex legal terminology like a bothersome insect. That is utterly ridiculous, she countered, her voice shaking slightly despite her bravado. We love our grandson deeply. We provide necessary structure. We teach him discipline and the fundamental value of hard work. That is not abuse. That represents traditional parenting. You have absolutely no proof to suggest otherwise. Victor extracted a glossy, high-resolution photograph from the top of the stack. He held the image up for a fraction of a second, ensuring everyone at the table could register the visual evidence. It was a surveillance still captured by the exterior security cameras exactly 2 weeks prior. The image clearly depicted a tiny, fragile boy standing in a torrential downpour. He was struggling mightily to drag a massive, wrought-iron patio chair across the slick stone terrace. The digital timestamp glowing brilliantly in the bottom corner proved the event occurred during a severe weather advisory. Victor flicked his wrist. He tossed the photograph across the table. The heavy, glossy paper sailed through the air and landed squarely in the center of the silver serving platter. It dropped directly onto the freshly sliced prime rib. The dark, rich meat juices immediately began soaking into the crisp edges of the image, permanently staining the proof of their cruelty with the grease of their stolen feast. Susan stared at the photograph resting on the meat. Her mouth fell wide open. The aristocratic facade she had spent a lifetime carefully cultivating disintegrated in a singular instant. Her breathing grew incredibly shallow and rapid. A severe hyperventilation took hold of her chest. She gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles matching the pristine white porcelain plates. Victor entirely ignored her physical distress. He locked his eyes onto her panic and began to speak. He did not read from the printed pages. He recited the complex legal code flawlessly from memory. According to Title 30, Article 4, Chapter 3 of the Indiana Trust Code, Victor stated, his voice devoid of any human emotion, a documented breach of the safe harbor provision retroactively revokes your protective status. You are no longer classified as invited guests. You are now legally categorized as hostile tenants. This sudden reclassification bypasses all standard eviction timelines. It explicitly authorizes immediate, forceful removal by law enforcement to secure the physical safety of the minor beneficiary. The contrast in the room was truly staggering. Susan was gasping for air, her chest heaving violently as the reality of her sudden homelessness crashed down upon her shoulders. Victor remained perfectly still, delivering a linguistic execution with robotic, terrifying precision. Howard remained paralyzed in his seat, completely unable to formulate a defense against a man who possessed actual, tangible power. But Victor was not finished dismantling them. He turned his attention away from my hyperventilating mother and looked down at the documents again. He pulled a colorful, highly detailed financial statement from the middle of the pile. The sudden reclassification of your residency is merely the administrative preamble, Victor continued smoothly. The primary issue we must discuss concerns grand larceny. He slid the financial statement toward the center of the table, placing it next to the ruined roast beef. 2 weeks ago, an attempt was made to authorize a $15,000 charge at a premium wellness retreat using a platinum account tied directly to the trust corpus, Victor explained. The physical credit card was entrusted to Susan for emergency groceries, but the digital authorization form required a verified signature from the primary account holder. Victor produced a secondary sheet of paper. It was the forged receipt I had discovered in my home office. This document contains a fraudulent digital signature, Victor stated, his tone growing noticeably colder. The geographic location data embedded deep within the digital ink traces back directly to the wireless router located in this very living room, precisely when the account holder was proven to be residing in Chicago. Forging a signature to access restricted trust funds is not a simple familial misunderstanding. Under federal statutes, it constitutes a Class C felony. The mechanics of this particular fraud are pristine, thoroughly documented, and completely inescapable. Bradley, who had remained remarkably quiet during the systematic destruction of our parents, suddenly shifted his weight. He leaned back, resting his broad shoulders against the carved wood of his chair. He picked up his crystal goblet and took a slow, arrogant sip of the expensive Cabernet. A low, arrogant scoff escaped my brother's lips. He placed the glass down and shook his head, a highly smug grin spreading across his face. He possessed a profound, dangerous ignorance regarding the situation. Bradley honestly believed his parents had orchestrated the entire financial scheme independently. He assumed Howard and Susan had stolen the wealth solely to pamper him, thereby absorbing all the criminal liability themselves. He felt perfectly insulated from the impending legal fallout. "Wow," Bradley muttered, looking at Howard and Susan with a toxic mixture of amusement and faux pity. "You two really messed up this time. I guess you should have read the fine print before you started signing things that did not belong to you." The dining room fell dead silent. The sheer audacity of his comment hung in the air, toxic and heavy. My parents stared at their golden child in absolute horror, realizing he was perfectly willing to let them sink to save his own skin. They had sacrificed their morality to elevate him, and he was laughing at their demise. Victor Cross stopped organizing the papers. He slowly turned his head. His cold, analytical gaze drifted away from my parents and locked directly onto my brother. The executor tilted his head a fraction of an inch, his expression sharpening into a look of lethal concentration. "You seem remarkably relaxed for a man sitting in the absolute center of a blast radius," Bradley Victor said softly. Bradley's smug grin faltered slightly. His eyes darted toward me, then back to the lawyer. "What are you talking about? I did not sign that spa receipt. My mother handled all the household accounts. I am just an innocent guest here. I have nothing to do with their financial mistakes." Victor placed both of his hands flat against the mahogany table. He leaned forward, closing the physical distance between himself and the golden child. The executor did not blink. The trap had successfully secured the older generation, but the largest, most punishing jaws were reserved entirely for the son who falsely believed he was untouchable. Victor maintained his physical position, leaning over the heavy mahogany wood. He stared directly into Bradley's eyes. The temperature inside the dining room plummeted. The sudden shift in focus from the parents toward the golden child caused a visible physical reaction. A thick layer of perspiration manifested across Bradley's forehead. He reached for his linen napkin and hastily dabbed at his brow. He attempted to project an aura of total innocence. "I have absolutely zero involvement in any property disputes or spa receipts." Bradley stammered his tone, completely lacking its previous arrogant resonance. "My mother manages those specific domestic accounts. I focus entirely on my entrepreneurial ventures. You cannot attach me to their bad decisions." Beside him sat his wife, Vanessa. She remained entirely silent, observing the unfolding catastrophe with intense, calculating scrutiny. She was a highly educated African-American woman hailing from a prestigious Atlanta lineage. Her grandfather had constructed a massive commercial real estate empire throughout Georgia during the 1970s. She possessed an innate generational understanding of genuine wealth. She married my brother under the strict assumption that he represented an equal financial partner, a successful heir to a massive Midwestern fortune. As the illusion began to fracture, her posture grew rigid. The affectionate deference she usually displayed toward her husband evaporated, instantly replaced by a cold, analytical preservation of her own status. "You are correct about the spa receipt," Victor acknowledged smoothly. "We do not believe you executed the digital forgery yourself. You lack the necessary technical competence to bypass a basic security firewall." Bradley blinked, unsure if he should feel insulted or relieved. He opened his mouth to agree, but the independent executor raised a single commanding finger, demanding absolute silence. However, Victor continued retrieving the final, thickest binder from the leather folder. "We possess a separate, far more severe legal concern regarding your personal entrepreneurial ventures." He dropped the heavy binder onto the table. The loud impact caused the expensive crystal glassware to rattle ominously. "This dossier contains 8 months of audited banking records," Victor explained carefully. "It meticulously details a highly coordinated scheme involving the theft of quarterly corporate dividends. The routing numbers on a high-yield private equity account were systematically altered. Those stolen funds were funneled through a joint checking account belonging to your parents, and then immediately wire transferred into your personal business ledger." Bradley's jaw tightened. The perspiration on his forehead intensified, forming large droplets that rolled down his temples. "Those were gifts from my father," Bradley argued, his pitch rising in panicked defense. "Howard told me he was liquidating his vintage stock portfolios to provide seed capital for my new technology startup. I had zero knowledge those funds originated from my sister's accounts." Victor tilted his head, projecting an aura of absolute legal supremacy. "Ignorance of the origin does not negate the crime of receiving stolen capital," the lawyer stated. "Furthermore, the sheer volume of the transfers elevates this offense beyond a simple civil dispute. We are discussing hundreds of thousands of dollars." Earlier this afternoon, my client formally submitted this entire evidentiary binder to the federal authorities. She pressed felony wire fraud charges against all 3 of you. The investigation is currently active. Susan let out a sharp, pathetic whimper, burying her face deeply into her trembling hands. Howard gripped the table edge, his knuckles turning completely white, totally incapable of defending his beloved son. "Yet the criminal liability represents merely the opening phase of your destruction," Victor continued, his voice dropping into a register of pure, lethal execution. "Let us examine the actual foundation of your technology startup." Bradley swallowed hard. His throat bobbed visibly. He reached into his tailored jacket pocket and withdrew his expensive smartphone, clutching the device like a physical talisman against the impending doom. "Your company possesses 0 proprietary software, no patent applications, and absolutely 0 actual revenue." Victor detailed, exposing the golden child's ultimate failure. "Your entire operational budget depends completely upon a massive commercial line of credit issued by a premium corporate bank in Chicago. You utilize that credit to lease a luxury office suite, purchase high-end company vehicles, and fund a lavish lifestyle to impress your new wife." Vanessa slowly turned her head. She directed a look of pure, unadulterated venom toward Bradley. Her prominent family valued fiscal responsibility above all other virtues. Discovering she had married a fraudulent, insolvent imposter constituted the ultimate betrayal of her lineage. Her jaw clenched tight, her beautiful features hardening into a mask of pure contempt. She realized every expensive dinner, every vacation, and every gift was financed by criminal deception. "I secured that credit line based on my own brilliant business plan," Bradley whispered, though his tone betrayed profound terror. "You secured nothing," Victor corrected instantly, shattering the final delusion. "No reputable financial institution lends 7 figures to an unemployed man possessing a long history of failed collegiate endeavors. That massive credit line was approved solely because Dilys Scott signed the foundational documents as your primary guarantor. She utilized her impeccable corporate credit rating to underwrite your pathetic fantasy." The realization struck Bradley with the force of a physical blow. His entire existence, his marriage, his luxury vehicles, and his arrogant persona were entirely subsidized by the sister he openly despised. He had spent his adult life mocking my ambition, completely unaware that my signature was the singular barrier keeping him from total ruin. A violent tremor seized Bradley's hands. He lost his grip on the expensive smartphone. The heavy electronic device plummeted toward the floor. It struck the Spanish ceramic tile with a sickening, definitive crunch. The impact instantly shattered the delicate digital screen, sending jagged spiderwebs of broken glass across the illuminated display. It was the exact same tile Howard had previously insulted, now serving as the brutal anvil that broke his son's most prized possession. Bradley stared down at the ruined device, unable to comprehend the rapid speed of his downfall. He looked utterly pathetic, a man stripped of his armor, standing naked before the consequences of his own arrogance. At precisely 8 o'clock this morning, Victor announced, checking a heavy gold watch resting on his left wrist, Dilys Scott formally contacted the underwriting department operating in Chicago. She officially revoked her guarantor status. She severed all financial ties to your commercial accounts forever. Bradley shot up from his chair, his knees knocked violently against the heavy wood. "What does that mean?" he demanded, panic completely overwhelming his senses. "It means the bank instantly recalculated your risk assessment," Victor explained calmly, savoring the destruction. "Without a qualified guarantor, your loan entered immediate default. The financial institution initiated a total recall of all outstanding capital. They have frozen your business accounts, locked your luxury office suite, and dispatched recovery agents to repossess your company vehicles. You are currently experiencing catastrophic, irreversible insolvency. You are officially bankrupt." The word hung in the air, heavy and definitive. Bankruptcy represented the ultimate taboo in American society, a permanent stain on one's social and professional record. For a man who built his entire identity upon the illusion of endless prosperity, it constituted a fate far worse than physical death. The shame would follow him everywhere, destroying any future prospects in the corporate sector. Vanessa stood up, gracefully. She did not yell. She did not cry. She simply picked up her designer handbag from the floor, adjusting the leather strap over her shoulder. She looked at Bradley with a cold, terrifying finality. She recognized a sinking ship, and her primary survival instinct dictated immediate evacuation. She walked out of the formal dining room without uttering a single word, leaving the golden child completely abandoned to face the wreckage alone. Howard finally erupted. The patriarch could no longer suppress his boiling rage. He slammed his heavy fists against the mahogany wood, causing the ruined roast beef platter to jump and the silver utensils to clatter loudly. "This is an absolute disgrace," Howard screamed, his face turning an unhealthy shade of crimson. His voice echoed violently off the high ceilings, echoing through the expansive corridors. He pointed a rigid, furious finger directly at my face. "You are a cold monster, Dilys. This is your own blood. This is your brother. We are a family. We raised you. We provided shelter and food. You are supposed to protect us from the cruel world. You do not destroy your own flesh and blood over money. Where is your loyalty, you ungrateful wretch?" I sat perfectly still at the far end of the long table. The screaming, the shattered glass, the ruined dinner, and the palpable panic swirled around me like a chaotic storm, but I remained entirely untouched. Inside the center, I felt an incredible, profound sense of peace. The decades of gaslighting, the constant belittling, and the sheer cruelty had finally culminated in this beautiful, symmetrical justice. I reached forward and picked up my crystal goblet. The glass was filled with chilled, sparkling water and a single fresh slice of lime. I brought the delicate rim to my lips and took a slow, refreshing sip. The cold carbonation danced lightly against my tongue, a crisp contrast to the heavy, suffocating tension filling the room. I swallowed, enjoying the clean sensation. I lowered the glass gently, placing it back onto the pristine white linen tablecloth with deliberate care. "I learned my loyalty from watching you, Father," I replied quietly, my tone perfectly even. My words sliced directly through his screaming fit, silencing the room once more. Howard stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, totally devoid of any coherent response. He had spent his entire life teaching me that power belonged strictly to the ruthless, and now he was horrified to discover I had mastered his cruel curriculum perfectly. He created the monster currently dismantling his life. Victor closed the thick leather dossier, signaling the absolute conclusion of the formal legal presentation. He adjusted his bespoke suit jacket, preparing to deliver the final logistical blow that would physically remove them from my property. "The paperwork is complete," Victor stated, gathering his briefcases. "The authorities have been notified regarding the wire fraud. The bank has successfully seized the commercial assets. Now we must address the immediate physical logistics of this residential property. The local sheriff's department will arrive at this estate in exactly 20 minutes to enforce the hostile tenant eviction order. I highly suggest you gather whatever personal clothing items you can carry, because you will not be allowed back inside to retrieve anything else." Before Howard could even begin to formulate another angry protest, a new sound pierced the heavy atmosphere. The faint, distant wail of police sirens began to echo through the dark, rainy night, growing steadily louder and more urgent as the cruisers approached the private iron gates of the Carmel estate. The piercing wail of the police sirens sliced through the suffocating, humid atmosphere of the dining area. The bright, rotating red and blue emergency lights began to reflect harshly off the rain-slicked window panes, casting chaotic, staccato shadows across the expensive imported wallpaper. My brother stood completely paralyzed amidst the absolute ruins of his fabricated empire, watching his fraudulent life dissolve in real time. Just moments prior, his elegant wife had collected her designer belongings and marched purposefully toward the grand archway. However, Vanessa did not exit the estate as initially expected. She halted precisely at the threshold, connecting the formal feasting space to the grand foyer. She possessed a formidable calculating intellect, honed by generations of brutal corporate maneuvering within her highly prominent Atlanta lineage. Her ancestors had survived brutal economic depressions and vicious hostile takeovers by strictly adhering to a singular, unforgiving philosophy. One must never tether their future prosperity to a rapidly sinking vessel. She slowly turned around, allowing her premium leather handbag to slip gently from her shoulder down into her perfectly manicured hands. The cold, analytical gleam radiating from her dark eyes indicated she had fully anticipated this exact, catastrophic failure. Bradley stared at her, his face contorted into a mask of pathetic, agonizing desperation. He reached out a trembling, sweaty hand, silently pleading for the unconditional emotional support his parents had always blindly provided. He genuinely expected his spouse to rush forward to console him and to offer a unified defensive front against the impending legal assault. He fundamentally misunderstood the core nature of the woman he had married. Vanessa valued supreme competence and financial stability above all other human traits, and her husband had just been ruthlessly exposed as an incredibly incompetent, insolvent parasite. "You are incredibly foolish," Bradley Vanessa stated. Her voice resonated with absolute freezing clarity, easily cutting right through the distant approaching rumble of the law enforcement vehicles. She did not raise her pitch or display any panic. She spoke with the calm, measured cadence of a seasoned corporate executive terminating a highly disastrous corporate merger. "Did you honestly believe I was completely blind to your glaring financial inconsistencies? I grew up meticulously reviewing commercial real estate portfolios long before I ever learned how to drive a vehicle. I recognize the distinct, rotting scent of insolvency, and your fraudulent technology startup smelled exactly like a decaying corpse for many months." Bradley physically recoiled backward, as if she had violently struck him across the face with a heavy object. His jaw dropped open and closed repeatedly, producing absolutely zero sound. Howard and Susan remained frozen tight in their heavy wooden seats, utterly horrified by the viciousness radiating directly from their daughter-in-law. They had always treated Vanessa with extreme cautious deference, secretly intimidated by her immense generational wealth and sophisticated worldly demeanor. Now they were witnessing the predatory nature of that immense wealth turned directly against their precious golden child. I noticed the sudden, unexplained influx of unaccounted capital shortly after we returned from our honeymoon. Vanessa continued smoothly, taking a slow, deliberate step back into the dining room. You confidently claimed you had secured elite angel investors, but your presentation deck was a disorganized, amateurish disaster. Genuine venture capitalists do not fund vague, nonsensical concepts managed by lazy men who spend their entire afternoons playing simulated golf. I knew immediately the money was entirely illicit. I simply needed to determine the exact origin to effectively shield my own personal assets from your inevitable criminal prosecution. She calmly unclasped the heavy brass hardware on her designer bag. The metallic click echoed sharply within the silent, tense space. I hired a private forensic accountant back in early October. The professional required exactly 3 days to trace your sloppy amateur wire transfers directly back to your sister's private equity accounts. The sheer audacity of her stark admission hung heavily in the air, thick and poisonous. She had known about the grand larceny for the entire duration of their marriage and said absolutely nothing to stop it. She had thoroughly enjoyed the luxurious tropical vacations, the expensive diamond jewelry, and the premium dining experiences, fully aware they were entirely financed by my stolen corporate dividends. She had simply waited in the shadows, quietly gathering ammunition, meticulously preparing for the exact moment the criminal scheme finally collapsed. "You knew," Bradley whispered, his voice cracking violently under the immense emotional strain. He forcefully grabbed the high back of his wooden chair to prevent his shaking legs from completely giving out. "You knew I was taking the funds, and you just let me do it." "I did not merely allow you to proceed," Vanessa corrected, a terrifying, victorious smile playing at the very corners of her mouth. "I actively facilitated your total destruction when the timing perfectly benefited my strategic exit strategy. When I discovered your foolish mother had forged the digital signature for that ridiculous wellness retreat, I realized the entire family enterprise was rapidly imploding. That chaotic, messy desperation threatened to drag my pristine public reputation down into your filthy gutter. I required absolute, undeniable legal immunity. Therefore, I contacted the trust management firm myself. The massive plot twist struck the room exactly like a physical shockwave. Victor Cross, who had been quietly organizing his massive stack of legal documents, paused his precise movements. He looked directly at Vanessa with a newfound flicker of genuine professional respect. "You were the anonymous informant," Victor confirmed softly. "I was the caller who verified the fraud alert," Vanessa admitted proudly, lifting her chin. "I provided the specific routing numbers to the investigators. I detailed the precise dates of the unauthorized capital transfers. I single-handedly orchestrated this entire financial audit. I needed you entirely compromised, Bradley. I needed you facing severe federal charges to ensure my divorce settlement proceeds flawlessly without any resistance. A convicted bankrupt felon possesses absolutely zero leverage in a family court proceeding. My elite attorneys will secure complete, undisputed ownership of all our remaining joint assets by tomorrow morning." She reached deep into the luxurious interior of her bag and retrieved a thick, meticulously bound blue ledger. It was not a simple notebook. It was a comprehensive, devastating diary of total financial ruin. She walked confidently toward the dining table, her expensive heels clicking rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor. She bypassed her devastated husband, completely ignoring his weeping form. She arrived at the far end of the mahogany surface and slid the heavy ledger directly toward the independent executor. The heavy book glided smoothly across the fine linen cloth, stopping precisely in front of Victor's steady hands. This specific book contains every single illicit transaction, Vanessa explained clearly. It details the offshore shell companies he desperately attempted to create, the fake vendor invoices he generated to launder the stolen capital, and the printed digital communications proving his premeditated criminal intent. It represents the final, inescapable nail for his coffin. use it well. The absolute devastating betrayal successfully shattered whatever fragile, delusional sanity remained within my brother. Bradley erupted into a visceral, agonizing scream. It was a guttural, animalistic wail of total disbelief and pure, unadulterated agony. He lunged wildly toward the table, desperately trying to grab the damning evidence before the lawyer could secure it, but his frantic legs tangled deeply within the heavy vintage rug. He crashed hard onto his knees, the sharp, broken glass from his previously shattered smartphone digging viciously into the fabric of his expensive trousers. He stayed down there on the hard floor, weeping openly and loudly, reduced to a broken, pathetic shell of the arrogant prince he had constantly pretended to be. Watching her beloved, invincible son violently collapse, Susan finally broke. A profound, entirely uncontrollable sobbing overtook her entirely. Her meticulously constructed reality, the lifelong illusion of a perfect, prosperous lineage, was tearing itself to bloody pieces right before her very eyes. The greedy people she had manipulated to elevate her social status were now eagerly slitting each other's throats to survive the financial slaughter. She covered her ruined face with her trembling hands, her hot tears heavily soaking into the expensive silk sleeves of her designer blouse. She wailed aloud, a high, piercing sound of pure, unadulterated grief, echoing off the ceiling. I remained perfectly still in my comfortable chair, calmly sipping my chilled carbonated water. I observed the total, spectacular chaos enveloping my toxic relatives with complete clinical detachment. The deep, festering wounds of my miserable childhood, the decades of cruel emotional neglect and psychological abuse, felt remarkably quiet inside my chest. The sheer, inescapable logic of their mutual destruction provided a profound, beautiful healing balm. I did not need to scream, yell, or cry. I simply allowed their inherent selfish toxicity to consume them entirely. They had built a massive, arrogant house of cards using stolen money and malicious lies, and the slightest breeze of absolute truth had leveled it completely to the ground. Victor Cross reached out and firmly placed his large, steady hand directly over the blue ledger. He accepted the definitive, undeniable evidence of the grand larceny. He looked down at the weeping man bleeding on the floor, then shifted his cold gaze toward the intensely sobbing woman clutching her face. The independent executor displayed absolutely no mercy or hesitation. "Your extensive cooperation is duly noted," Vanessa Victor stated smoothly, securing the book inside his briefcase. "The federal prosecutors will undoubtedly appreciate the extensive, organized documentation." The heavy, demanding knocking at the front door commenced once more. It was incredibly loud, highly authoritative, and accompanied by the bright, rotating flash of emergency lights spilling generously through the foyer windows. The local authorities had officially arrived to enforce the hostile eviction mandate. However, Victor did not immediately move to open the heavy entrance. He paused, opening the cover of the newly acquired blue ledger, quickly scanning the very first page of Vanessa's meticulous records. A strange, highly unexpected frown deeply creased his forehead. He flipped rapidly to the second page, his sharp eyes darting quickly across the tight columns of numbers. He suddenly looked up, his gaze entirely bypassing the weeping Bradley and locking directly onto my father. Howard had remained entirely silent during the vicious betrayal, completely paralyzed by the overwhelming rapid cascade of disasters. "This documentation is indeed incredibly comprehensive," Victor murmured, his professional tone shifting entirely from cold execution to genuine calculating intrigue. "But there is a massive, glaring discrepancy hidden right here on the first page. These specific offshore accounts listed securely in the Cayman Islands do not belong to your son. The routing protocols predate his technological startup by at least 15 entire years." The loud sobbing in the room suddenly hitched and stopped. Howard stiffened rigidly, his pale, sweating face instantly turning a ghastly, terrifying shade of gray. Victor looked directly across the table at me. It heavily appears your brother was not the original architect of this massive embezzlement scheme, Dillis. He was merely utilizing an established, hidden pipeline, a secret pipeline created by someone who has been quietly draining massive assets long before the Vanguard Legacy Trust was ever officially conceived. The devastating revelation regarding the hidden offshore accounts paralyzed my father completely. Howard had spent decades cultivating a pristine public image, constantly lecturing everyone around him regarding fiscal responsibility and moral superiority. He demanded absolute obedience under the guise of patriarchal wisdom. Yet the undeniable truth was finally exposed beneath the harsh glare of the dining room chandelier. He was the original architect of the massive embezzlement scheme, having established the secret financial pipeline long before my brother ever conceptualized his fraudulent technology startup. The crushing weight of his own profound hypocrisy pinned him silently to his expensive mahogany chair. Vanessa did not waste a single fraction of a second absorbing the newest scandal. The highly ambitious African-American executive possessed a brilliant calculating mind, forged within the competitive arenas of corporate Atlanta. She recognized a fatal, uncontainable liability immediately. She smoothly adjusted her tailored designer jacket, stepped gracefully over her weeping husband, and walked briskly toward the grand foyer. She did not cast a single backward glance toward the family she was abandoning. The heavy oak entrance opened and closed with a definitive echoing slam. She successfully evacuated the sinking ship, securing her own legal immunity while leaving her fraudulent spouse entirely alone to face the incoming wrath of the federal prosecutors. With Bradley incapacitated by immense grief on the floor and his intelligent wife fleeing the estate, my parents were abruptly stripped of their final defensive barriers. They possessed absolutely no remaining leverage. Their carefully constructed sanctuary of stolen wealth and unearned social dominance was entirely dismantled. Victor Cross directed his cold, analytical attention away from the sobbing younger man. The independent executor offered a subtle, commanding nod toward his silent legal associate. The professional woman moved with terrifying mechanical efficiency. She unzipped the secondary compartment of her premium leather briefcase, retrieving 2 thick, heavy envelopes. These specific documents bore the unmistakable embossed seal of the state judiciary. She stepped carefully around the ruined feast, bypassing the spilled Cabernet and the stained roast beef, and extended her arm directly toward my father. Howard stared blindly at the extended envelope. His arrogant posture had completely evaporated, replaced by the hollow, terrified stare of a defeated criminal. He absolutely refused to raise his hands. He could not bring himself to accept the physical manifestation of his ultimate downfall. The legal associate did not attempt to force the delivery. She simply opened her fingers, allowing gravity to dictate the outcome. The heavy envelope plummeted downward, striking the expensive hardwood floor. The crisp, heavy thud of the official notary stamp echoed violently against the custom-painted walls. That singular heavy noise symbolized the absolute termination of his delusional reign. It was the undeniable sound of a fabricated empire crashing permanently into dust. Susan watched the legal document fall, and her aristocratic illusion shattered into a million irreparable fragments. My mother had spent her entire adult existence desperately cultivating a flawless image within the elite wealthy circles of our affluent community. She obsessed over exclusive country club memberships, charitable gala invitations, and the superficial admiration of her wealthy neighbors. She suddenly realized she was about to become the most spectacular, disgraceful scandal in the entire region. Her wealthy peers would inevitably discover the humiliating truth regarding her financial crimes. The sheer terror of impending public humiliation and catastrophic poverty broke her spirit completely. She abandoned every ounce of her remaining pride. Susan collapsed onto her knees beside the table, her silk blouse wrinkling terribly. She clasped her trembling hands together in a frantic, desperate plea, directing her tearful gaze across the room toward me. "You cannot do this to us, Dilys," Susan begged, her voice cracking under the immense emotional strain. She deployed her ultimate weapon, attempting to weaponize maternal guilt. "I am your mother. I carried you. I raised you in a respectable home. You cannot throw your own family out onto the street like common criminals. Think about the terrible gossip. Think about what our friends will say when they see us ruined. We will be entirely destroyed. Please show some basic human compassion. We are truly sorry for the misunderstandings." I remained perfectly still in my comfortable chair. I took a final, slow sip of my chilled sparkling water, letting the cold carbonation wash away the lingering tension in my throat. I placed the crystal goblet down onto the white linen tablecloth. I looked at the pathetic, kneeling woman who had actively facilitated my emotional destruction for years. The time for silent endurance had officially concluded. I finally spoke my first substantial dialogue of the entire evening. "Your definition of a misunderstanding is incredibly convenient, Mother," I stated quietly. My voice was calm, completely devoid of the chaotic anger that usually fueled our family arguments. I did not yell. I simply delivered the pristine, agonizing truth. "You expect unconditional compassion and absolute forgiveness because you share my genetics. You demand the luxurious protection of this estate while simultaneously treating the actual owner like an indentured servant." I leaned slightly forward, resting my hands upon the polished wood. My gaze shifted from Susan to Howard, ensuring they both absorbed every single syllable. "2 weeks ago, during a massive freezing rainstorm, you forced a tiny 7-year-old boy to drag heavy iron furniture across a slippery stone patio," I recounted smoothly. My tone remained frigid, a sharp contrast to their sweaty panic. "When that child stumbled inside, shivering and bleeding from his palms, you did not offer him warmth. You did not offer him basic medical care. You stood in this exact room, drinking expensive wine purchased with my stolen dividends, and you told my son he should be profoundly grateful you allowed him to stay inside his own home. You told an innocent boy he was a burden." Susan gasped, burying her wet face into her hands, completely unable to deny the cruel incident. "You utilized my wealth to construct a comfortable fortress for yourselves, and you used your manufactured authority to torture my child." I continued relentlessly. "You constantly preach about the sacred nature of family loyalty, yet you gladly sacrificed your own daughter and grandson to ensure Bradley never had to experience a single consequence for his endless failures. You are not a respectable matriarch, Susan. You are a parasite. And you, Howard, are nothing more than a common thief wearing a tailored suit." I pushed my chair backward and stood up gracefully. The dining room felt remarkably small, now populated entirely by broken, crying individuals who had finally met the natural consequences of their toxic behavior. The documents resting on the floor outline the formal parameters of your immediate future. I explained, looking down at them with clinical detachment. "You have exactly 30 days to entirely vacate this property, remove your personal belongings, and secure alternative housing arrangements. However, that generous 30-day grace period only applies to your physical possessions remaining in the storage units." Howard slowly raised his head, a look of profound confusion mixing with his terror. "What do you mean?" he choked out. "The law enforcement officers currently waiting outside by the front gate are not here to observe a civilized transition," I informed him, delivering the final surprising blow. "Because you violated the safe harbor clause by physically endangering a minor, your legal status was instantly downgraded tonight. You lost your residency privileges the second Victor presented those photographs. The 30-day notice is purely an administrative formality for your junk. You are leaving this house tonight, right now." Susan let out a horrifying shriek of pure despair. "You cannot force us into the rain tonight," she wailed wildly. "I am simply applying the exact same logic you utilized on my son," I replied coldly. "You claimed hard work and exposure build strong character. You will have an excellent opportunity to test that specific theory while you walk down the driveway." I turned my back on the weeping, ruined family. I did not offer them another glance. I walked smoothly out of the formal dining room, leaving them surrounded by the shattered glass, the ruined dinner, and the crushing weight of their incoming legal destruction. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the grand hallway as I opened the heavy front door to welcome the police officers inside, completely satisfied that justice had finally been served within the walls of my home. 14 days evaporated since the disastrous eviction mandates shattered their insulated reality. The physical removal from the luxurious Carmel property was undeniably brutal, yet the true agonizing punishment manifested as total societal annihilation. Howard stood rigidly upon the impeccably manicured grass of the 18th hole at the most exclusive athletic reserve in Indianapolis. The bright Midwestern sun beat down upon his shoulders, but he felt absolutely freezing inside. He wore his standard pastel polo shirt and tailored trousers, desperately attempting to project an aura of unbothered affluence. For 3 decades, he had carefully constructed this pristine public facade. He originated from a gritty working-class neighborhood on the edge of the city, spending his entire youth deeply ashamed of his modest roots. He clawed his way into the elite financial echelons through aggressive networking, strategic marriages, and ruthless self-promotion. His core identity relied entirely upon the unwavering respect of his wealthy peers. Without that collective admiration, he was essentially a hollow shell. He reached into his pocket and retrieved his mobile device. He dialed the private number belonging to the organization president. The call rang exactly 4 times before clicking directly into an automated voicemail system. Howard tightened his jaw. He disconnected the line and immediately dialed again. Another robotic greeting echoed against his ear. A cold bead of perspiration materialized along his hairline. He initiated a 3rd consecutive attempt. The result remained identical. The president, a man who previously sought his financial advice over premium cigars every single Friday, was now actively avoiding him. This silent rejection represented a terrifying pebble of truth rolling down a steep mountain. During the past fortnight, the disgraced patriarch and his wife had launched a frantic, aggressive misinformation campaign. They contacted every prominent socialite, corporate ally, and country club acquaintance. They crafted a highly dramatic, fabricated narrative regarding their sudden relocation. They claimed their daughter had suffered a catastrophic psychological collapse. They painted Dilys as a deeply unstable, paranoid woman who forcefully expelled her loving parents during a severe manic episode. They gambled heavily on the assumption that polite society would instinctively trust the established elder over the quiet, introverted younger relative. They fundamentally underestimated the lethal efficiency of the independent executor. Victor Cross did not keep the legal devastation confined to the private dining room. He officially filed every single judicial document directly into the open court registry. The Indianapolis elite operated upon a currency of whispered scandals and toxic gossip. Within 48 hours of the public filing, the Vanguard Legacy Trust violations became mandatory reading for every wealthy housewife and corporate executive in the metropolitan area. The specific legal codes dictating the immediate eviction were widely circulated. More devastatingly, the high-resolution photographic evidence demonstrating the cruel exploitation of a 7-year-old boy was digitized and shared across countless encrypted messaging groups. The undeniable proof of child endangerment instantly destroyed any lingering sympathy for the ousted grandparents. Society could tolerate greed, but exposing a minor to physical hazard violated an unspoken, sacred boundary. Simultaneously, the comprehensive felony wire fraud indictments provided an irresistible feast for the local business community. Howard had spent years lecturing younger investors about fiscal morality. Now those same investors were eagerly downloading the detailed federal charges outlining his massive embezzlement scheme. The hypocrisy was spectacularly delicious to his rivals. Several prominent firms formally published press releases distancing themselves from his consulting enterprise. The catastrophe expanded far beyond the golf course. Across town, Susan experienced her own brutal reckoning. She possessed a deep, complex background rooted in profound insecurity. She spent her formative years wearing discounted clothing, constantly observing the philanthropic matriarchs of the city from a painful distance. When she married her husband, she utilized his generated wealth to aggressively purchase her way onto the most exclusive charitable boards. She equated gala invitations with intrinsic human value. She arrived at a prestigious downtown hotel for the annual Children's Hospital fundraising luncheon. She wore a stunning designer dress, plastering a confident, gracious smile across her face. She approached the registration table fully expecting the usual deferential treatment. The event coordinator, a woman Susan had previously mentored, looked up with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. The coordinator did not offer a name tag. She simply informed the older woman that her presence was no longer desired. She explained that the steering committee held an emergency vote that morning. Due to the highly public nature of the ongoing criminal investigations, specifically the charges involving the theft of family assets, the former matriarch was permanently blacklisted from the organization. The coordinator signaled a nearby security guard politely but firmly, demanding the disgraced socialite vacate the premises immediately. The utter humiliation of being escorted out of the grand lobby, surrounded by the staring eyes of her former friends, fractured her sanity completely. The carefully curated 30-year facade dissolved into worthless ash right there on the patterned carpet. The consequences multiplied rapidly. The morning edition of the premier local business journal featured a massive, full-color photograph of Bradley's mugshot on the front page. The Golden Child had attempted to hide inside a luxury downtown hotel after his catastrophic financial ruin. Federal agents apprehended him in the lobby. The accompanying article detailed the collapse of his fraudulent technology startup. It thoroughly explained how his brilliant African-American wife, Vanessa, had swiftly executed an aggressive divorce strategy. She utilized her powerful Atlanta legal team to secure immediate immunity, freezing all remaining joint accounts and leaving the accused felon with absolutely zero resources to hire competent criminal defense attorneys. He was currently languishing inside a county holding cell, completely abandoned by the spouse he falsely thought he commanded. Back in her newly reclaimed home, Dilla sat peacefully in her sunlit office, reviewing the digital news feeds. She experienced a profound sense of closure. The American legal system, often criticized for its slow pace, had moved with terrifying swiftness to correct the balance of power. The public destruction of her abusers validated every silent tear she had shed over the past decade. She sipped a hot cup of green herbal tea, savoring the quiet victory. The monsters who tormented her were locked outside the castle walls, devoured by the very society they worshipped. Standing on the 18th hole, Howard finally accepted the inescapable reality of his situation. He watched a modified golf cart accelerating across the fairway, heading directly toward his location. The vehicle carried the club manager and two large, uniformed private security officers. The manager stepped onto the grass, his face devoid of any customary warmth. He loudly announced that the board of directors had formally revoked the patriarchal membership, effective immediately. He cited the morality clause embedded within the organizational bylaws. The other wealthy golfers nearby stopped their matches, openly staring and whispering, as the disgraced man was forcefully ordered to surrender his titanium clubs and exit the private reserve. He retreated to his modest rented apartment on the outskirts of the city. He locked the flimsy door behind him, desperate for any remaining shred of hope. He still harbored one final hidden safety net. He booted up his laptop, intending to access the secret offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands. He had established those specific financial pipelines 15 years ago, long before the Vanguard Trust ever existed, siphoning massive amounts of capital into untraceable international vaults. It was his ultimate insurance policy against disaster. He typed his complex security credentials into the encrypted portal. He waited for the massive balance to populate the screen, praying the digital numbers would provide temporary comfort. The web page refreshed slowly. The screen flashed a bright crimson warning message. The display indicated 0 available funds. The entire offshore portfolio had been completely drained. A new email notification chimed loudly from the computer speakers. He opened the message with trembling fingers. The sender was completely anonymous, but the attached document was terrifyingly familiar. It was a digital copy of the exact same blue ledger Vanessa had surrendered to the executor. However, this specific version contained an additional, highly detailed addendum highlighting the international accounts. The email contained only 2 sentences. It explicitly stated that the global banking authorities had officially seized the illicit assets based on a highly detailed anonymous tip provided 48 hours ago. The secondary conflict instantly ignited within his chest. Victor Cross was focused entirely on the domestic trust violations. Dillis possessed no knowledge of the international banking codes. Someone else entirely had tracked his oldest, deepest secrets. He realized with horrifying clarity that a new, unseen predator was actively hunting him, ensuring his punishment extended far beyond the borders of domestic society. He was completely destitute, internationally flagged, and entirely alone. The shadow war had only just begun, and his unknown adversary possessed unlimited ammunition. 29 days marked the exact duration of their agonizing descent into total ruin. The setting of our final confrontation shifted entirely from the opulent, historic private estate to the incredibly sterile, highly intimidating corporate headquarters belonging to the independent executor. Victor Cross operated his massive legal enterprise out of a towering glass and steel skyscraper located in the very heart of the downtown financial district. The formal boardroom was an absolute masterpiece of cold, unfeeling architecture. The space featured an enormous rectangular table, crafted entirely from thick, translucent glass, surrounded by highly ergonomic black mesh chairs that offered 0 physical comfort. There were no warm oil paintings or soft woven carpets decorating this environment. The massive room was meticulously designed by expensive corporate psychologists to strip away all emotional leverage, effectively reducing every single human interaction to pure, calculated commerce. My parents entered the grand space looking profoundly diminished. The arrogant, untouchable swagger that previously defined Howard had completely vanished, permanently replaced by the frantic, darting energy of a hunted animal. His formally tailored, expensive charcoal suit now hung loosely upon his rapidly shrinking frame. The mysterious international financial seizure had terrified him far beyond rational thought. He spent the last 2 weeks desperately searching the internet for the anonymous predator who brutally drained his secret offshore accounts, finding absolutely nothing but dark, dead ends. Susan walked slowly beside him, nervously clutching a surprisingly cheap synthetic leather handbag. The permanent, highly public banishment from her elite charitable organizations had aged her significantly. Her posture, once rigorously straight and fiercely proud, now curved inward, instinctively shielding her fragile ego from the constant, overwhelming public scorn. I sat quietly at the far end of the transparent surface wearing a sharply tailored navy blazer. I observed their pathetic arrival with complete clinical detachment. Victor sat precisely to my right side, meticulously organizing a small stack of pristine legal documents. The formally requested mediation was their final, pathetic gambit. They possessed absolutely 0 legal standing, but their monumental, lifelong entitlement somehow convinced them they could still successfully manipulate a lucrative exit strategy. Howard cleared his throat nervously. The dry sound echoed harshly against the soundproof acrylic walls. He desperately attempted to project his former patriarchal authority, but his vocal cords trembled slightly under the immense pressure. He launched directly into a meticulously rehearsed, highly delusional monologue. He spoke extensively about his immense personal sacrifices. He painted a highly fictionalized, glorious picture of my childhood, heavily emphasizing the expensive shelter, the premium food, and the prestigious educational opportunities they supposedly provided. He completely omitted the severe psychological torture, the blatant favoritism, and the constant financial exploitation that actually defined my youth. "We are entirely willing to walk away quietly," Howard proposed, leaning heavily against the cold glass. "We will formally surrender the residential keys today. We will not actively contest the pending civil litigation in court. We will simply disappear from your life forever." However, starting over at our advanced age requires substantial liquid capital. Considering the multiple decades we spent raising you into a highly successful corporate woman, we require a formal severance package, a final, respectful financial compensation for our immense parental investment. We are asking for exactly $5 million. That is a tiny fraction of your overall trust portfolio, but it is enough to ensure your mother and I can retire gracefully somewhere out of state. Susan nodded vigorously, adding her own pathetic justification to the outrageous demand. "It is the honorable choice, Delis," she whispered, her eyes wide with desperate, misplaced hope. "You have so much unlimited wealth now. You cannot simply leave us to rot in the streets. Think about your own karma. Think about the legacy of this family." I allowed a profound, heavy silence to completely dominate the large boardroom. The auditory absence stretched for an agonizing, calculated minute. I looked directly into their desperate, aging faces. I reached smoothly inside the inner breast pocket of my tailored blazer. I slowly withdrew a single, highly crumpled piece of paper currency. It was a standard green $1 bill. I placed it firmly onto the transparent surface. I pressed my index finger directly against the printed face of the president. With a smooth, deliberate physical motion, I pushed the tiny denomination across the slick glass table. The bill glided effortlessly, stopping precisely in front of my father's trembling hands. That specific piece of currency represents the absolute maximum threshold of my generosity. I stated clearly, my tone dropping to a freezing, lethal register. I spent the entire previous weekend meticulously calculating the precise monetary value of your parental contribution to my personal development. I subtracted the profound financial cost of the extensive psychological therapy I required to simply survive your toxic household. I deducted the exact dollar amount you systematically stole from my corporate accounts over the past 5 years. I also removed the immense punitive damages associated with the cruel child endangerment you intentionally inflicted upon my young son. When the final mathematical equation was fully resolved, this singular dollar emerged as the only remaining positive balance. Howard stared blankly at the pathetic green rectangle, his face rapidly contorted in pure, unadulterated outrage. "You are insulting me," he hissed, his voice rising in aggressive volume. "I am giving you a highly accurate appraisal of your actual worth." I corrected him immediately, refusing to break eye contact. "You possess absolutely no negotiating power in this building. The grand, arrogant illusion is permanently shattered. You are an exposed felon facing imminent federal indictment, and your wife is a completely disgraced social pariah. If you do not formally sign the total surrender documents and hand over the estate keys by exactly 5 o'clock this evening, the county sheriff will arrive at your temporary rental apartment. The armed authorities will physically drag you out onto the public sidewalk. You will not receive a multi-million-dollar severance package. You will receive handcuffs and a jail cell." The flawless, impenetrable logic crashed down upon him like a massive concrete vault. The absolute lack of any remaining leverage entirely paralyzed his cognitive functions. The terrifying reality of imminent incarceration and total, inescapable poverty broke the very core of his arrogant spirit. He looked pleadingly toward Susan, desperately expecting her to conjure another clever argument. But she was simply crying silently, completely surrendered to their miserable fate. Howard reached forward with a violently shaking hand. He picked up the heavy black ink pen provided by the executor. He scrawled his signature across the bottom of the dense legal contracts, officially forfeiting his final claims to the grand estate. He pushed the documents back across the table, a completely defeated and hollow man. The climactic victory felt incredibly satisfying, yet the heavy boardroom door suddenly clicked open, instantly disrupting the quiet finality. A highly confident woman strode purposefully into the sterile environment. It was Vanessa, the brilliant African-American sister-in-law who had ruthlessly abandoned my brother weeks prior. She wore a stunning white designer suit, projecting an aura of total financial supremacy. She bypassed my ruined parents entirely and took the empty chair located directly beside my left arm. Howard gasped aloud, realizing the two powerful women he feared most were now sitting comfortably together. Vanessa opened her pristine leather briefcase and retrieved a thick, heavily stamped international banking folder. She slid the detailed financial summary directly toward the terrified patriarch. "You wasted 2 entire weeks searching for a mysterious global hacker," Vanessa stated, a victorious, sharp smile illuminating her beautiful face. "Did you honestly believe I would dismantle your son's pathetic technology firm without investigating the deepest roots of his criminal education? I tracked your hidden Cayman Island accounts months ago." I turned toward my new corporate ally, publicly acknowledging our highly secret alliance. Vanessa and I recognized a highly mutual benefit, I explained to my horrified father. She required absolute leverage to guarantee her divorce settlement, and I required complete access to the offshore funds you originally embezzled from my grandfather. We successfully repatriated every single cent back into the Vanguard Legacy Trust early this morning. You are completely bankrupt. Howard slumped backward against his chair, his breathing incredibly ragged, finally realizing he was thoroughly outmatched by a coordinated, genius strike. However, Vanessa did not close her briefcase. She withdrew one final, highly classified document and handed it directly to Victor Cross. The independent executor reviewed the single page, and his usually unflappable professional demeanor visibly fractured. He looked up, his eyes widening with genuine, undeniable alarm. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. "The repatriated funds are completely secure," Victor announced, softly, his voice tight with sudden anxiety. "But this newly discovered document outlines a separate, massive commercial liability." Before his physical arrest, Bradley somehow managed to forge Dilla's signature one final time. He successfully secured a massive predatory loan from a highly dangerous, unregulated, private syndicate operating out of Las Vegas. The brutal syndicate leaders are now demanding immediate repayment, and they firmly believe Dillis is entirely responsible for the massive outstanding debt. The sudden revelation regarding the dangerous Las Vegas syndicate hung heavily within the cold boardroom. Victor Cross looked genuinely terrified, fully aware of the violent reputation associated with unregulated gambling debts. However, I did not experience a single moment of panic. I simply looked at Vanessa, and my brilliant sister-in-law offered a slow, predatory smile. She opened her pristine briefcase one final time. She calmly produced a certified, federally stamped document from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She explained that her elite legal team had uncovered the forged syndicate loan during their initial forensic sweep several weeks ago. Instead of hiding the immense liability, she had immediately submitted the fraudulent contract directly to the federal authorities. The dangerous Nevada loan sharks were heavily raided by armed government agents mere hours ago, neutralizing the physical threat. Furthermore, the undeniable proof of the forged signature legally transferred the entire financial burden squarely onto my brother. Bradley was now permanently indebted to a dismantled criminal enterprise, ensuring his misery would continue long after his eventual release from prison. The checkmate was absolute. Howard stared at the federal document, finally realizing he had lost every single battle. He slumped forward, a broken man, while Vanessa and I walked out of the sterile corporate headquarters, victorious and free. The immediate aftermath of the brutal corporate war focused upon the meticulous restoration of domestic peace. 30 days had passed since the dramatic boardroom confrontation, and the dense, suffocating toxicity that previously poisoned my life was eradicated. I returned to the Grand Carmel property alongside my young son, Leo. The expansive estate did not simply feel empty, it felt fundamentally purified. During the chaotic eviction process, I had hired a premium specialized commercial sanitation crew. They worked tirelessly for a full week, erasing every physical and emotional residue left behind by my relatives. They replaced the vintage dining room rugs, repainted the formal hallways in bright, cheerful tones, and removed every piece of heavy, oppressive furniture that Howard had aggressively purchased. The profound internal transition from merely surviving daily psychological abuse to actively thriving in unadulterated freedom was intoxicating. I walked barefoot across the newly polished hardwood floors, feeling the warm sunlight streaming through the immense bay windows. I was no longer a silent, trembling victim held hostage by the malicious demands of a fake patriarchy. I was the undisputed architect of my own destiny, securing a vibrant, untouchable future for my child. While I basked in the glorious warmth of my reclaimed sanctuary, my disgraced parents experienced the harsh, unforgiving reality of their new existence. Howard and Susan were forcefully relocated to a cramped, heavily depreciated, low-income apartment complex located 2 states away. They were irrevocably cut off from my vast wealth. The transition from a sprawling mansion to a tiny, poorly ventilated concrete box destroyed whatever fragile sanity they possessed. The thin plaster walls offered zero insulation from the constant loud arguments of their desperate neighbors, and the pervasive smell of stale cigarette smoke permanently saturated their cheap clothing. Howard spent his miserable days sitting on a stained second-hand sofa, staring blankly at a tiny television screen, stripped of his beloved country club status and his stolen offshore accounts. Susan, formerly the arrogant queen of the local charity galas, was now forced to navigate crowded public transportation just to purchase discounted groceries. Her wealthy friends had permanently blocked her phone number, leaving her isolated in a dangerous, unfamiliar neighborhood. They were defenseless, effectively imprisoned by the severe financial poverty they had previously mocked. Their spectacular downfall was a masterpiece of poetic justice, illustrating the natural consequences of extreme arrogance and prolonged cruelty. The concept of poetic justice extended even further when applied to my criminal brother. Bradley successfully avoided a maximum security federal prison due to a restrictive plea deal, but his alternative punishment was infinitely more humiliating. The arrogant golden child was currently serving an extensive court-mandated community service sentence for his numerous wire fraud convictions. Far away from his simulated golf games and luxury sports cars, he was forced to wear a highly visible, unflattering, bright orange safety vest. He spent his long, agonizing afternoons scrubbing public park restrooms on the humid outskirts of the city. He dragged heavy buckets of cheap bleach and wielded rough bristle brushes cleaning filthy porcelain toilets under the strict supervision of a ruthless municipal officer. The grueling physical labor perfectly mimicked the exact manual labor he and my parents had cruelly forced upon my young son during that freezing rainstorm. His soft, manicured hands were now covered in painful blisters and deep calluses. Every time Bradley scrubbed a grimy concrete floor, he was forced to remember the luxurious empire he had foolishly squandered. Inside the quiet, secure walls of my pristine home, a beautiful pebble of absolute tranquility settled into place. Leo sat happily at the newly purchased dining room table. He was deeply engrossed in a colorful drawing, his vibrant crayons moving rapidly across the thick paper. He was meticulously sketching a picture of a strong, impenetrable castle, proudly coloring the towering stone walls with bright blue wax. His small hands were healed, showing zero signs of the previous injuries he sustained moving heavy patio furniture. More importantly, his bright eyes were free of fear. He no longer flinched at sudden noises or constantly checked the hallway for angry relatives. He was simply a joyful, creative child living in a safe environment. I stood silently by the large window, sipping a steaming cup of rich, dark roast coffee. I watched a gentle breeze rustle the green leaves of the ancient oak trees lining the driveway. I looked down at the smooth marble counter where a heavy, sealed legal folder rested quietly. That thick document represented my ultimate weapon. It was the undeniable truth, meticulously documented and executed without a single ounce of mercy. I had successfully dismantled a generational cycle of abuse using flawless logic and sheer corporate willpower. However, the continuous narrative of absolute power rarely concludes without a sudden, unexpected complication. As I finished my warm beverage, my private cell phone vibrated sharply against the stone counter. The caller identification displayed a secure, restricted government number from Washington. I answered the call, expecting a routine update from my offshore asset manager regarding the recently repatriated funds. Instead, a calm, authoritative voice belonging to an unknown man echoed through the speaker. He introduced himself as a senior investigator for the Internal Revenue Service. He politely congratulated me on recovering the stolen capital, but then dropped a devastating legal bombshell. Because Howard had originally embezzled the money decades ago and failed to report the offshore gains, the federal government was now imposing a substantial retroactive tax penalty. The investigator explained that since the Vanguard Legacy Trust had formally absorbed the illicit funds this morning, my pristine corporate entity was legally responsible for a staggering $40 million federal tax deficit. He stated that I had exactly 72 hours to liquidate my remaining legal assets to cover the immense governmental debt, or the state would seize the Carmel estate and place my pharmaceutical company into federal receivership. A brand new, incredibly dangerous conflict materialized instantly, forcing me to prepare for a brutal, high-stakes financial war against the most powerful institution in the country. The echo of a slamming oak door reverberates far longer than the fleeting comfort of a stolen dollar bill sliding across a corporate glass table. When the dust finally settles upon the manicured lawns of affluent American suburbs, and the meticulously forged legal documents are locked away, we are forced to confront a terrifying mirror. The collapse of a patriarchal empire is rarely an overnight phenomenon. It is a slow, generational decay cultivated within the quiet, seemingly respectable confines of a traditional household. For decades, we have been conditioned to construct grand physical sanctuaries for our children, prioritizing sweeping staircases, elite country club memberships, and flawless public reputations. We mistakenly believe that immense material wealth and curated social status are adequate substitutes for genuine moral guidance. Yet the brutal unmasking of a father's deceit and a mother's hollow social ambitions forces us to ask a profound, unsettling question. What are we truly passing down to our descendants when the lights go out? Is it a legacy of genuine emotional awareness, or is it simply a beautifully decorated cage of inherited trauma and silent compliance? The fundamental bedrock of genuine family responsibility is deeply rooted in the unwavering concepts of fairness, transparency, and emotional honesty. When parents operate under a polished facade of moral superiority while privately engaging in devastating hypocrisy, the psychological damage inflicted upon the next generation is catastrophic. A traditional American family structure is theoretically meant to serve as a child's first, most vital classroom. It is supposed to be a safe harbor where they learn the intricate, necessary balance between personal action and societal consequence. However, when the reigning authority figures demand absolute obedience while entirely absolving themselves of any accountability, the very definition of family transforms into a dangerous weapon. We observed a fallen matriarch who equated her intrinsic human value with exclusive gala invitations and proximity to power. We witnessed a disgraced patriarch who utilized his financial prowess not to nurture, but to establish a ruthless domestic dictatorship. They possessed every conceivable educational and economic advantage modern society could offer, yet they fundamentally failed the most critical assignment of human existence. They entirely forgot how to love without imposing suffocating conditions. They traded genuine connection for superficial control, ultimately discovering that a foundation built upon lies cannot withstand the fierce winds of justice. There is a profound, agonizing lesson embedded within the tragic downfall of the favored child. Modern parenting is absolutely not the act of endlessly shielding a son from the natural, painful repercussions of his own failures. By constantly intervening, by consistently manipulating the legal and financial systems to rescue a golden child from his own incompetence, a parent commits a terrible, irreversible disservice. They inadvertently raise a fragile, entitled adult, completely unequipped to navigate the uncompromising realities of the real world. When a young man is implicitly taught that his indiscretions and massive financial thefts will always be magically erased by a parent's hidden checkbook, he develops an artificial, dangerous arrogance. Society, however, is a much harsher disciplinarian than a doting mother. The world does not ultimately care about an expensive zip code or the historical prestige of a family surname. Eventually, the protective domestic bubble violently bursts. The devastating image of a once proud corporate heir forced to perform grueling manual labor in a public park, scrubbing filthy porcelain while wearing a humiliating safety vest, is a stark reminder. When families stubbornly fail to enforce boundaries and ethical discipline within the absolute safety of the home, the judicial system will eventually enforce those exact boundaries in the brutal, unforgiving public square. True loving guidance requires the immense courage to let our children fail. It requires the fortitude to let them feel the stinging weight of their mistakes, so they might truly learn the vital importance of personal integrity before it is entirely too late. Conversely, the true essence of enduring strength lies in the heartbreaking, necessary act of breaking a toxic generational curse. Emotional awareness is the ultimate, most effective antidote to inherited cruelty. It requires a terrifying level of vulnerability to look directly at one's own flesh and blood and accurately recognize the severe toxicity they bring into a household. The bold courage to professionally sanitize a physical and emotional space to forcefully eject the architects of your childhood pain is not an act of petty vengeance. It is an act of profound preservation. A mother standing in a sunlit room, looking at her young son's fully healed hands as he peacefully colors a fortress free of fear, is actively witnessing the beautiful rebirth of a family line. It is the powerful realization that shared genetics alone do not grant someone unrestricted access to your mental peace or your child's safety. The idealized American dream is frequently associated with financial prosperity, but the most crucial dream is raising a child in an environment where their innocent tears are acknowledged, their physical safety is fiercely guarded, and their spirit is allowed to flourish without the heavy shadow of a compromised elder hovering above them. It is about establishing a new paradigm where respect is earned through consistent kindness, not demanded through financial intimidation. These complex tapestries of blind loyalty, shocking betrayal, and the agonizing pursuit of ultimate truth resonate so deeply with audiences because they are not simply entertaining works of fiction. They are haunting reflections of the silent, desperate battles fought within countless dining rooms and corporate boardrooms across the country. The intense struggle to successfully reconcile the flawed parents we were given with the supportive parents we desperately needed is an almost universal human journey. We all carry the invisible, heavy ledgers of our childhoods, constantly calculating the emotional debts owed to us and the profound, staggering costs of our hard-won independence. Exploring these intricate, explosive domestic wars helps us identify the hidden, dangerous fractures within our own psychological foundations. For those who find solace in unraveling these narratives, for those who seek to understand the devastating societal consequences of betrayal and the triumph of reclaiming one's narrative, I invite you to subscribe and follow the channel Linda Vengeance. Together, we will continue to explore the darkest corners of family dynamics and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. As the evening shadows stretch quietly across the pristine hardwood floors of our reclaimed, sanitized sanctuaries, we are ultimately left entirely alone with our deepest thoughts. The absolute weapon against inherited familial dysfunction is the unvarnished, documented truth, executed without a single ounce of hesitation or misplaced mercy. Yet even in the warm glow of absolute victory, a lingering, complicated chill remains in the quiet air. When you systematically tear down the corrupted, fraudulent empire of your ancestors, when you finally lock the heavy, secure doors against the very people who brought you into this world, you secure your absolute, undeniable freedom. But as you stand silently looking out the grand glass window, watching the distant emergency lights fade into the dark, rainy night, you must inevitably wonder, in our desperate, ruthless pursuit to destroy the abusers and avoid becoming the monsters who raised us, how closely do our own cold reflections begin to resemble them? The massive estate is finally silent. The historic debts are paid in full. But the true cost of our survival is a personal ledger that remains permanently open, waiting silently for the unpredictable ink of tomorrow.